Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past isn't dusty, it's electric. Tonight, we're sailing the Nile from its first muddy villages to the glitter of Alexandria, tracing how a river taught people to build with time itself. In the next 2 hours, you'll watch farmers become pyramid makers, local chiefs become pharaohs, and simple offering tables evolve into engines of eternity. We'll climb Djoser's step pyramid and stand in the shadow of Giza. Step inside embalming rooms to see how chemistry turned memory into mummies, and decode hieroglyphs to hear real voices, scribes, artisans, queens, speaking across 3,000 years. You'll feel the gears of the old kingdom click into place, then slip during famine and war, only to be tuned again in the Middle Kingdom with good paperwork and better ethics. You'll ride with Ahmose as Egypt reboots, meet Hatshepsut, the queen who ruled as king, and follow Thutmose III as empire becomes geometry. You'll enter Akhenaten's sun-drenched revolution, breathe the cool restoration under Tutankhamun and Horemheb, and march with Ramesses II from the noise of Kadesh to the quiet power of the world's first peace treaty. But Egypt isn't just pharaohs. We'll eat bread and beer in kitchen courtyards, gossip with Deir, el-Medina's artisans on coffee break ostraca, and walk the sacred avenues of Karnak and Luxor, where processions stitched a nation together. We'll measure pyramids with rope stretchers, set bones with ancient doctors, and tell time with stars, shadows, and dripping water. Then the horizon widens. Sea peoples, Libyans, Cushites who restore Egypt from the south, Sate reformers who build with memory, Persians and Greeks who translate power across languages, and Ptolemaic Alexandria. Lighthouse blazing, library collecting the world, Serapis and Isis crossing seas. Finally, Cleopatra, Caesar, Antony, drama, strategy, and the end of the pharaohs followed by afterlives in Rome, the desert birth of monasticism, the Rosetta breakthrough, and today's careful science that reads hearts as well as hieroglyphs. If you've ever wondered how a civilization can last 3 millennia, this is your front row seat. Hit play, settle in, and let History Teller YT show you why Egypt's real magic was never sorcery. It was order, imagination, and the stubborn kindness of everyday people keeping Ma'at, balance, alive. The story of ancient Egypt begins with water, silt, and rhythm. Each year the Nile flooded its broad valley, soaking fields and leaving behind a black, fertile topsoil that Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land. In a world where desert, Deshret, the Red Land, stretched endlessly east and west, that narrow green ribbon made life predictable. Farmers learned to read the river's moods, sowing after the inundation and harvesting before the next rise. Over generations, this cycle became more than agriculture. It was a philosophy of balance and renewal, the cosmic pulse that taught people to trust in recurring patterns. Fishing, papyrus cutting, and birding supplemented grain, while river traffic bound villages into networks of exchange. Geography did not merely shape survival. It trained minds to expect order. Such order nurtured cooperation. Irrigation channels had to be dug and maintained. Basin dikes had to be measured and rebuilt. Communities shared labor and storage, developed leaders to arbitrate disputes, and kept records, initially as knotted cords and tallies. The Nile also connected worlds. From the south came gold, ivory, and exotic woods. From the Sinai and eastern desert came copper and hard stones. From the Mediterranean arrived ideas, plants, and occasional strangers. Boats, with their high prows and square sails, were the trucks of antiquity, moving barley, linen, and beer upriver and down. With prosperity came specialization. Potters, flint knappers, bead stringers, and, increasingly, administrators who oversaw granaries and mobilized work crews. A landscape of reeds and mud brick matured into one of shrines, processions, and seasonal fairs. Yet the Nile's predictability also hid danger. Too low a flood meant famine. Too high a flood meant destroyed villages. These threats pushed communities to seek not only engineering solutions, but spiritual assurance. They honored local gods, fertility spirits, falcon lords, cobra protectors, seeking favor and stability. Rituals promised to align human effort with cosmic will. Across centuries, this web of beliefs and practical governance converged towards centralization. Villages clustered into nomes, districts. Strongmen became chiefs. Chiefs found reasons, defense, storage, water rights, to cooperate under larger banners. Out of the marshes and mud brick rose an idea that a single, sacred ruler could guarantee the river's order, the land's prosperity, and the people's justice. Before pyramids, there were painted pots, carved palettes, and elite burials that read like whispering records of change. In Upper Egypt, communities such as Nakada and Hierakonpolis grew influential, experimenting with iconography. Boats bearing standards, animal processions, and kings as fierce bulls breaking down city walls. Cemeteries expanded into social statements. Grave goods with imported stones, copper tools, lapis beads, announcing the rise of families whose wealth derived from trade control and labor command. In Lower Egypt's delta, where waterways braided through reeds, power was more diffuse but no less ambitious. These two zones began to eye one another across the long axis of the river, competing for prestige goods and ritual legitimacy. Artifacts chart the approach of statehood. Cosmetic palettes evolved from utilitarian to ceremonial, their surfaces filled with scenes of domination and celebration. Maces become symbols of authority. Standards show animals linked to shrines, early emblems of territorial identity. As leaders claimed divine sanction, they sponsored temple compounds and festivals that bound people emotionally to their banners. The logic of scale kicked in. Bigger storehouses reduced spoilage. Larger labor pools built levees faster. More centralized records curbed theft. Warfare, raids for cattle, captives, and mines, accelerated consolidation by rewarding alliances and punishing the slow to unify. Victory narratives spread, inspiring emulation. Defeat compressed small polities into the orbit of rising chiefs. By the late pre-dynastic period, one power from Upper Egypt, linked in later memory to a figure called Narmer, seems to have achieved decisive advantage. The famous palette bearing his name shows a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one face and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, implying union under a single sovereignty. Whether Narmer was the unifier or a celebrant of a process already won by predecessors, the message is clear. The Nile's two lands were proclaimed one. A royal court stabilized at Memphis, near the delta's apex, ideal for controlling both northbound trade and southern tribute. The new state inherited local cults and customs, but reframed them under a higher order. The king was not just a successful warlord. He was a living embodiment of cosmic balance, the hinge upon which heaven and earth aligned. Egypt's kingship did not sell itself merely with armies. It promised Ma'at, a principle that blends truth, justice, balance, and right proportion. The pharaoh's role was to set Ma'at and destroy Isfit, chaos, to keep the Nile timely, the seasons steady, and the borders secure. This was theology with administrative teeth. To enact Ma'at, the court developed a bureaucracy of viziers, scribes, surveyors, and granary officials who measured fields with knotted cords, counted harvests with inked reeds, and redistributed surplus to workers and temples. Taxes often arrived as grain or labor. In return, the state maintained canals, stored food for lean years, and staged festivals that symbolically renewed the cosmos. Stability became a shared project and a habit. Ideology fused with image. The king was Horus, the falcon god whose far-seeing eye guaranteed vigilance. At death he became Osiris, the lord of the underworld, ensuring continuity between rulers as between years. Royal titulary multiplied. Horus name, Neti, two ladies, name, golden Horus name, and the Nesset Bidi name signaling he of the sedge and bee, a poetic way to say king of Upper and Lower Egypt. These titles appeared on monuments and seals, branding shipments and proclamations. Temples, staffed by learned priests, became both spiritual engines and economic hubs, owning fields, herds, and workshops. The palace temple complex thus managed grain, rituals, and prestige crafts, spreading an aesthetic of order from architecture to accounting. Crucially, writing, early hieroglyphs, emerged as the state's nervous system. Carved on labels tied to jars or painted on tomb walls, signs named officials, counted goods, and commemorated deeds. Literacy was rare, but its authority was universal. A sealed jar with a royal serek, palace facade plus Horus falcon, meant the crown had touched it. A decree carved in stone meant permanence. Over time, these tools scaled up the possible. If you can record how many workers arrive, you can plan pyramid crews. If you can list offerings, you can sustain temples for centuries. If you can frame justice as cosmic balance, you can make paying taxes feel like participating in the sunrise. When statecraft learned to speak the language of eternity, Egypt stepped into history as a civilization unusually confident in its own purpose. In the Third Dynasty, a ruler named Djoser authorized a project that reimagined permanence. On the plateau of Saqqara, instead of a traditional mastaba tomb of mud brick, his court built in stone. First one mastaba, then a series of enlargements stacked into a six-tiered step pyramid. This innovation demanded logistics: quarries to cut limestone, ramps to haul blocks, teams to set courses with astonishing regularity. The mind behind the design, remembered as Imhotep, became a legend. Chancellor, high priest, engineer, and later even a deified sage. The step pyramid complex spread across a ceremonial landscape: courtyards, shrines, dummy chapels, carved as if the afterlife needed a full royal city. Stone architecture altered everything. Mud brick had memory, but limestone had eternity. Columns could be imitated in stone as bundled reeds. Ceilings could mimic timber. Whole facades could pretend to be matting. Egypt's architects translated the language of the marsh into rock. The project taught the state to coordinate tens of thousands over many seasons, to feed them, house them, and supply tools at scale. It taught surveyors to lay right angles across horizons and to align gateways to cardinal points, their eyes marrying rope stretcher geometry to the stars. With stone came a new emotional register. Subjects could see their king's ambition from miles away, a stairway for the soul that literally changed the skyline. The complex also encoded theology. Ritual spaces within it staged the said festival, a royal rejuvenation rite that symbolically reset the king's vigor and, by extension, the world's balance. Enclosures and corridors created a controlled pilgrimage, guiding priests through performances that secured Djoser's eternal authority. The step pyramid thus fused three powers: engineering, administration, and religion, into one argument: that the pharaoh's claim to universality could be proven in limestone. Later kings understood the message. If the realm could master stone in tiers, why not attempt pure geometry? The step would be smoothed. The stairway would become a ray. What followed was an architectural arms race that would define the Old Kingdom's golden horizon. Sneferu, founding king of the 4th dynasty, turned experimentation into state policy. His builders first raised a pyramid at Midam that shifted from step-sided to smooth. Structural issues may have caused partial collapse. Undeterred, the court moved to Dashur, where they constructed the bent pyramid, which changes angle mid-slope, a problem solved in real time, perhaps due to subsidence or concern about stability. Then came the triumph. The Red Pyramid, Egypt's first successful true pyramid with unwavering sides, its desert-pink core blocks catching late sunlight like embers. These attempts were not failures, but laboratories teaching engineers about load paths, casing stones, internal chambers, and ramp logistics. The scale required a nation. Quarries boomed. Carpenters fashioned sledges and levers. Potters made jars for water, beer, and oil. Herders supplied meat. Farmers sent grain as tax in kind. Were crews, organized into named gangs and sub-teams. Took pride in their sections, scrawling jokes and emblems on blocks. Administrators scheduled deliveries by season, swelling labor during the Nile inundation when fields rested. Surveyors laid baselines with remarkable precision. Astronomer priests sought true north by observing circumpolar stars, chasing immobility in the spinning heavens. Every solved problem became a template. How to dress casing stones so their outer faces formed a laser-clean plane, how to polish them to mirror brightness, how to ventilate internal passages so workers could breathe in the bowels of stone. Sneferu's projects also refined the political economy. Royal estates were endowed to feed funerary cults. Nearby satellite pyramids and mastabas rewarded elite families whose loyalty anchored the regime. Villages for workers arose with bakeries, breweries, clinics, and dorms, evidence that the system invested in basic welfare to keep productivity high. In art, this era standardized royal portraiture, broad chest, calm gaze, idealized vigor, an icon that traveled on statues sent to provincial temples. By the time Sneferu died, Egypt possessed not only 2 monumental pyramids at Dashur and a rebuilt Midam complex, but a playbook for making mountains out of limestone. His son would push that playbook to its limit, chiseling ambition into the very horizon of human imagination that Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza is less a building than a statement about possibility. Over 2 million stone blocks, arranged with sub-centimeter alignments, rise to a slope that once shone with white Tura limestone casing. Inside, ascending corridors lead to the Grand Gallery and a granite-sheathed king's chamber capped with relieving courses, an elegant solution to crushing weight. Around the pyramid sprawls an entire sacred city, boat pits for solar journeys, cemeteries of mastabas for nobles, and a causeway to a valley temple where rituals animated stone with incense and chant. Khafre, Khufu's successor, placed his pyramid slightly smaller but on higher ground beside the Great Sphinx, a colossal lion with a royal face, guardian of the necropolis. Menkaure added a compact, refined pyramid, its lower courses dressed in granite, a statement of quality over scale. For generations, people imagined these works as the fruit of slave labor, but archaeology paints a different picture. Excavations of workers' villages reveal planned housing, bakeries turning out thousands of loaves, breweries bubbling with beer, and skeletal remains showing both hard labor and medical care. Crews bore humorous names, friends of Khufu, drunkards of Menkaure, and carved them on blocks like sports teams tagging victories. This was corvée labor, yes, tax obligations and work. yet the state fed, housed, and treated its builders. Craftsmen honed mastery. Stonecutters, plasterers, levermen. Logisticians scheduled sledges along lubricated tracks. Priests timed ceremonies so the sun's daily resurrection bathed chapel walls in living gold. The result was not just architecture, but choreography, a nation trained to move in concert. Giza also crystallized ideology. Pyramids were not merely tombs. They were resurrection engines, cosmic ramps for the pharaoh to join the imperishable stars. Pyramid texts, spells carved inside later pyramids, speak of the king becoming a falcon, a star, a god among gods, eating knowledge, spitting out chaos. The Sphinx, half lion and half king, embodied royal might and solar guardianship, watching the eastern horizon where the sun is reborn. Visitors in later ages could only marvel. Greek travelers credited divine skill. Yet the splendor carried a cost. Such concentration of resources risked straining provinces, hardening social hierarchies, and tying legitimacy to colossal stone. When climate and politics shifted, the system that raised mountains would need to learn humility or face unraveling. Egyptian religion was less a set of commandments and more a map of relationships between visible and invisible, body and spirit, earth and sky. A person comprised multiple elements. The Ka, a vital double that needed food offerings. The Ba, a mobile personality often depicted as a human-headed bird. The Run, the name whose memory sustained existence. The Shut, the shadow, and ideally the Ak, an effective spirit transformed through correct rituals. Death was not an ending, but a border crossing into the Duat, an underworld that mirrored Egypt in strange geometry. Fields of reeds, gatekeepers with names of power, waterways of peril, ferrymen who demanded passwords learned from sacred texts. Morality and cosmic order intersected at the Hall of Judgment. There, according to later tradition elaborated in the New Kingdom, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Mot. A heart heavy with wrongdoing, lies, theft, violence, risked annihilation by Ammit, the devourer. One did not fear eternal torment so much as the terror of non-being. To pass, the dead recited negative confessions, I have not stolen, I have not murdered, and leaned on amulets, spells, and the goodwill of gods. Osiris the judge, Thoth the recorder, and protective deities who guided the worthy through gates and lakes. This moral vision tied everyday honesty to cosmic survival. To cheat a neighbor was to endanger your own eternity. Rituals translated belief into technology. Offerings set on tomb tables fed the Ka. Recitations empowered statues to breathe and receive. Tomb scenes, plowing, fishing, feasting, were not diaries but engines. Images could become realities for the Ak if properly consecrated. The living kept the dead alive by speaking their names, pouring water, and renewing funerary endowments. In return, honored ancestors, now Aku, could intercede for their families, nudge fortune, and bless harvests. This reciprocal economy of care made memory a civic duty. It also explains Egypt's passion for durable monuments and legible inscriptions. If your name is carved in stone and your heirs keep the offerings flowing, you do not fade. Eternity in Egypt was a social contract anchored in ethics and maintained by art. Mummification was the most sophisticated funerary technology of the ancient world, evolving from simple desert desiccation into a multi-stage craft. The goal was preservation of recognizability. The Ka and Ba needed a familiar home to visit. In classic procedures, embalmers first removed the brain through the nose with hooks. Brains were not the seat of identity for Egyptians. Then opened the left flank to extract viscera. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were treated and placed in canopic jars guarded by the four sons of Horus. The heart, believed to house conscience and memory, usually stayed in the chest, sometimes protected by a heart scarab amulet bearing a plea to remain silent on Judgment Day. The body was then dehydrated with natron, a naturally occurring mix of sodium salts, for around 40 days. After shrinkage, embalmers anointed tissues with resins and oils, pine, cedar, pistacia, whose antimicrobial properties doubled as perfume. Artisans patted cheeks, reshaped noses, and restored contours, aiming for a calm, idealized face. Linen bandaging followed with ritual precision, layers interspersed with amulets, the jed pillar for stability, the tayat knot for protection, the ujat eye for health. Priests recited spells, and the opening of the mouth ceremony symbolically restored senses so the deceased could eat, see, and speak in the afterlife. Coffins evolved from simple boxes to nested masterpieces painted with protective texts and sky maps, transforming the mummy into a miniature cosmos. Economics stratified access. Royal and elite mummies received the full treatment, gilded masks, and lavish tomb equipment. Furniture, games, shabby figurines meant to perform labor in the fields of eternity. Commoners had simpler burials but might still receive amulets, a painted coffin, and a few offering jars. Embalming workshops formed near necropolises, their craft guarded and professionalized. Accounts list fees, materials, and options, proof that eternity had price tiers. Over millennia, techniques changed. Late period wrappings became elaborate, Ptolemaic portraits on wood captured lifelike faces. Yet the aim remained recognizable continuity. The Egyptian wager was bold. If you master decay, script your name into stone, and live by Ma'at, then death becomes a doorway, not a void. The mummy is that wager made visible, a human life converted into art and chemistry for the long journey beyond. Egypt's writing system, hieroglyphs, was a fusion of picture and sound. Owls, reeds, and lions that could represent ideas, consonants, or classifiers clarifying meaning. A single word might weave phonetic signs with determinatives that silently signaled category. A papyrus roll to mark documents, a man with hand to mouth to signal speech, a seated god to tag divine names. For daily work, scribes also used hieratic, a cursive script written in ink with a reed brush on papyrus, wood, or pottery sherds, ostraca. Centuries later, demotic, an even more streamlined script, took over many administrative and legal functions. At the very end of pharaonic history, the Rosetta Stone, inscribed in hieroglyphs, demotic, and Greek, would allow modern scholars to crack the code, but for Egyptians, writing was never merely code. It was an act of creation. Scribes trained in houses of life, temple-adjacent schools where they copied model texts, proverbs, and letters. Literacy conferred status and stability. Be a scribe. One school text urges, there is no job without a boss except the scribe. With a palette of black and red inks, they registered land surveys, filed court cases, composed hymns, and drafted royal decrees. In tombs, hieroglyphs turned walls into machines. Offering formulas invited passers-by to speak the name and thus renew the dead supply of bread and beer. Autobiographies fixed a life into narrative. Pyramid texts, then coffin texts, then the Book of the Dead offered roadmaps and passwords for the perilous afterlife. Writing stored grain in numbers, law in clauses, memory in stone, an infrastructure as vital as canals. Aesthetics mattered. Hieroglyphs were arranged in pleasing squares, balanced left to right or right to left, depending on which way the signs faced. The god's name was often highlighted, enclosed in protective cartouches for kings. To deface a name was to injure a soul. To reign scribe, it was to resurrect. This gave writing a political edge. Damnatio memoriae could erase rivals. Restorations could heal history. Even humor surfaced. Scribal ostraca show cartoons of animals aping humans, hinting at classroom levity. Across 3,000 years, scripts evolved, genres blossomed. Wisdom literature, love poetry, travel tales like the shipwrecked sailor. Through it all, the reed brush stitched Egypt together, granting the state long memory and giving individuals a chance at a second life in words. When the old kingdom's glitter faded, Egypt did not explode. It slowly unraveled. Flood levels dipped erratically, too low to renew fields, too high to spare villages, and surplus narrowed into scarcity. The central court, long practiced at coordinating labor for stone mountains, discovered that granite solves few problems when granaries are half empty. Provincial governors, the nomarchs, had grown powerful in the earlier boom, managing irrigation, storage, and local courts. In lean years, their responsibility hardened into independence. They commissioned rock-cut tombs with autobiographies that sounded like job applications to eternity. I fed the hungry in my town. I kept the riverbanks. I did Mott when the palace failed. Egypt's map, once a single thread stitched by Memphis, frayed into competitive patches. Heracleopolis holding the north, Thebes sharpening its ambitions in the south, oases and frontier towns adjusting to new trade winds and old anxieties. Yet decline was no dark age of silence. It was a laboratory for new voices. Literature that later scribes treasured likely crystallized from these tensions. Laments about social inversion. Dialogues where a weary man debates his own soul. Hymns that question whether justice is anywhere to be found. The cosmic guarantee that pyramids had seemed to offer, the king is sunbeam-made stone, was audited by drought and distance. In that audit, local ethics shone. Households doubled down on reciprocity. Village shrines became safety nets. Kin groups defended canals like lifelines. The visual arts shifted from the icy perfection of royal sculpture to intimate, sometimes quirky portraits in provincial tombs, where families gather around offering tables and musicians pluck strings for the afterlife, as if to charm sorrow itself. Even funerary customs diversified. Wooden coffins gained painted panels, eyes for the dead to gaze out, spells to guide their steps, because eternity, once centralized, now needed neighborhood branches. The first intermediate period was not just about less. It was about different. With the palace's monopoly on grandeur broken, innovation proliferated in how people imagined fairness, kingship, and the good life. Nomarchs experimented with local law. Temples stewarded land and reinterpreted festivals with regional flair. Trade did not stop. It rerouted. Nubian gold, desert copper, Levantine timbers, and northern oils still flowed, but via a web of bargains rather than a single command. Out of this improvisation rose a fierce idea in Thebes. That order could be rebuilt, not by pretending the crisis had not happened, but by admitting its lessons. Humility before nature, partnership with provinces, and a kingship that earned devotion not by stone alone, but by justice felt in bread ovens and canal gates. Theban princes transformed lament into program. From their southern stronghold, they fought northward against Heracleopolitan rivals, pushing battle lines along the lifeline of the Nile. The stakes were cosmic and daily at once. To unite the two lands was to recenter Mott and to make tax, law, and flood management answer again to a single horizon. Mentuhotep II, the Theban star who finally prevailed, branded his victory as both military and ritual. At Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank opposite Thebes, he built a terraced funerary complex that staged reunion as theater. Porticos pierced by colonnades echoed cliffs. Ramps invited processions to climb as the sun does. Chapels folded in memories of shrines from across Egypt, as if to tell the uneasy land, "Your gods are welcome here, your voices included in my breath." Statues of the king appeared in dark, Osirian paint and in living flesh tones, signaling his dual identity, ruling in light, renewing in death. Reunification was not glue poured over cracked pottery. It was kintsugi, repair with gold. Administration, weakened by famine and feuding, needed redesign. Mentuhotep's regime reorganized districts, rotated officials, and tightened audits. The army became a permanent instrument rather than a seasonal levy, garrisoning fort points and guarding caravan roads. Thebes elevated Ammonius, a god of invisible power, as patron. By twinning Ammonius with the sun god into Ammonius Are, priests cast Thebes' local deity as a universal force without erasing older solar theology. This syncretism lubricated political healing. Northerners could see their own sun cult honored in the South's rise. Ceremonies stitched ideology with logistics. Royal jubilees aligned with tax remissions, temple endowments yoked to canal maintenance, pilgrim festivals doubling as census moments. The message: unity is not just a crown, it is a schedule that feeds you. Mentuhotep's victory did not erase memory of hardship. Instead, it institutionalized resilience. Tomb autobiographies now advertised not only generosity, but competence. I kept grain accounts, I balanced measures, I returned runaway laborers to their homes without cruelty. Art reclaimed refinement while keeping regional warmth. Reliefs regained composure without freezing into courtly distance. The state's legitimacy deepened because it went beyond spectacle. Though spectacle returned magnificently to demonstrate that the palace had learned to listen. With the two lands classed again, a new dynasty would build on these foundations, defining one of Egypt's most beloved eras. The Middle Kingdom, the age of wise kings, clean records, literate hearts, and a quiet confidence that poetry and policy could share the same breath. The Middle Kingdom radiated a calmer brightness. Kings like Amenemhat I and Senusret III tuned the machinery of state so it hummed rather than thundered. They replatted nomes, strengthened the office of vizier, and created royal Ichtai, a city of administration whose very name, Caesar of the two lands, sounded like competence turned into streets. Tax was still grain and labor, but assessment improved. Survey cords stretched across reclaimed Fayum fields. Storage silos mapped supply, not just for harvest festivals, but for drought buffers. The court sent expeditions to Sinai for copper and turquoise, to Wadi Hammamat for stone, and deep into Nubia for gold, anchoring these corridors with elegant fortresses whose thick walls, wells, and granaries were as much trade valves as military teeth. At Semna and Buhen, inscriptions recorded flood heights and border policies with a bureaucrat's precision and a poet's pride. Literature blossomed into genres still taught in scribal schools centuries later. The tale of sinew folded politics, exile, and longing into sentences that could make a clerk pause and breathe. Wisdom texts, instructions of Amenemhat, Tahotep's maxims in refreshed copy, offered ethics for officials. Be calm, measure speech, listen more than you command. Coffin texts, expanding the old pyramid spells to common coffins, democratized a roadmap to eternity. Not just kings, but many householders could now own words that opened gates in the Duat. Art found a new face of truth. Royal statues sometimes show tired eyes and lined cheeks, a realism that reads less as weakness than as moral authority. I have seen trouble, and I will still do right. Temples accrued economic heft, but kings managed their influence with endowments that bound priestly wealth to civic tasks. At home, towns like Kehen near a royal pyramid reveal grid streets, bakeries, clinics, and scribal houses, snapshots of daily life humming under planned roofs. Jewelry from elite burials glows with granulation and inlaid stones, as if artisans translated good governance into gold's grammar. Abroad, diplomacy flexed. Expeditions to Punt, cautious dealings with Levantine cities, and watchful eyes on emerging chariot cultures. Senusret III, stern in his reliefs, likely tightened Nubian policy to secure gold and trade routes, while maintaining river order that farmers far to the north would feel as predictability inbred. The Middle Kingdom did not rival Giza's mountains, yet many later Egyptians looked back on it with nostalgia. A time when kings were wise, officials were fair, and words could fix the world. On papyrus in the day, in the mouth of the justified dead at night. As Middle Kingdom rhythm slowed, new actors entered the Delta. Groups later labeled Hyksos, probably a mosaic of Levantine peoples who leveraged trade savvy and military tools, most famously the horse-drawn chariot and composite bow. They established a northern capital at Avaris, fusing Egyptian and Near Eastern styles in their material culture, while Theban dynasts held the south. For a time, this duality was friction more than fire, treaties, trade, and parallel courts. But identity is an ember in dry reeds. The Theban line, chafing under tribute and affronts real or staged, framed resistance as a sacred duty. Seqenenre Tao's skull, scarred by war, whispers that negotiations bled into battles. His descendants, Kamos, and then Amos I, sharpened war into policy. Amos besieged Avaris, harried foes into southern Levant, and pursued them into Shruhin, forging a template of preemption that future kings would admire. Victory did more than restore borders. It remade Egypt's military and ideology. Chariots and new bows remained, now in Egyptian hands, and the army professionalized with ranked officers, foreign auxiliaries, and reward systems, gold collars, land grants, and recorded deeds for tomb walls. Thebes' god Ammonius surged in prestige as patron of victory. The king emerged not merely as shepherd, but as conqueror ordained by a hidden power. Wore booty-fed temples and funded building. Almost reopened quarries, refurbished temples bruised by neglect, and launched a building campaign that signaled, after doubt, certainty, after division, one voice. The court also looked south. Nubia, rich in gold and strategic in the river's narrative, was re-garrisoned, its forts repaired or rebuilt, its elites courted and managed by a mix of carrot, stick, and marriage diplomacy. Social mobility stirred. Soldiers who distinguished themselves could rise. Autobiographies of Amos, son of Abana, detail river battles and hand-to-hand valor. Crafts learned to serve a more mobile, multi-ethnic army. Logistics refined provisioning along routes that now stretched far beyond old Middle Kingdom horizons. Religious festivals turned victory into ritual renewal. Processions of Ammonius framed political choices as divine preferences. The new kingdom was born, not only as a line of kings, but as a machine of expansion where war, wealth, worship, and administration braided into a rope strong enough to haul Egypt onto the international stage. Soon queens would rule in their own right. Trade ships would nose into fragrant southern seas, and empire, in all its brilliance and burdens, would become the realm's new normal. Into this rising chorus stepped Hatshepsut, daughter of a king, wife of a king, and, when her husband died, regent for a boy who would later be famous. At first, she stands beside the child as a protective elder. Soon she takes on full royal titulary, not as queen, but as king, complete with Neem's headdress and ceremonial beard and art. This was more than costume. Titulary changed grammar. Reliefs call her His Majesty. Statuary shows a body stylized as male, not to deny her womanhood, but to plug her into the cosmic socket reserved for kingship. Her claim rested on divine birth narratives. Ammonius himself procreated her in her mother's chamber, and on performance, she ruled well. Her masterpiece is the terraced temple at Deir el-Bahari, a symphony of colonnades unfolding from desert cliffs, harmonizing with Mentuhotep's older complex nearby while surpassing it in elegance. Reliefs there depict the famed Punt expedition, long ships on the Red Sea, exotic myrrh trees uprooted in baskets to be planted at Thebes, a queen of Punt with distinctive form greeting emissaries, piles of incense and ebony and gold recorded with accountant's relish. Hatshepsut framed trade as triumph equal to conquest, sweetening Ammonius' altars with foreign perfumes and feeding Egypt's artisan workshops with rare woods. She built widely, obelisks piercing Karnak's sky, chapels and statues that recalibrated the city's ritual map. In her reign, prosperity felt like a home fragrance, present in every room, hard to describe in words, but unmistakable to the nose. Politics under a female king required choreography. Hatshepsut promoted loyal officials, Senenmut, the gifted commoner who oversaw building and tutored the young prince. Haphusneb, high priest of Ammonius who balanced temple and palace interests. She kept foreign policy steady. Garrisons in Nubia measured assertion in Levant, preferring prestige architecture and cult endowments to risky campaigns. Late in her memory, some of her images were defaced or usurped, likely during the later dominance of the boy she had once overshadowed. But erasure is never total. The stones still speak. Inscriptions of flourishing granaries, scenes of myrrh trees rooted in Theban soil, obelisks bragging of being cast in electrum to flash at dawn. Hatshepsut's legacy suggests an empire confident enough to let a woman reinvent kingship without breaking it, ambitious enough to broadcast that reinvention in granite. When Thutmose III took full control, he did not dismantle Hatshepsut's achievements. He repurposed the momentum. He led annual or near-annual campaigns into the Levant, most famously the battle and siege around Megiddo, where he outflanked a coalition by choosing a risky mountain pass and then settled in for a systematic reduction of resistance. His annals read like a merchant's dream and a general's notebook. Lists of towns, tribute in metals and grain, herds, chariots, and hostages. Inventories of exotic woods, fine vases, and skilled captives who would soon be embedded in Egypt's economy. He pressed up the Orontes, flirted with Syrian ports, and likely cast a wary eye at Mitanni across the Euphrates, testing how far Egypt's sun could rise before it met another dawn. Empire under Thutmose III was not raiding. It was geometry. Vassal rulers sent their sons to Egypt for education, hostages wrapped in etiquette, so that loyalty would be a habit learned in Karnak's courtyards. Garrisons and way stations pinned supply lines. Diplomatic marriages folded foreign princesses into the royal house, braiding bloodlines with treaties. At home, spoils funded expansions at Karnak. The festival hall, the parade of obelisks, pylons that turned processions into urban theater. Art reached crystalline brilliance. Reliefs snap with disciplined line, while in private tombs of officials at Thebes, painters froze moments of fishing, fowling, banquets with musicians, and scenes of captured animals cataloged with almost scientific curiosity. The scribe's palette and the archer's bow served the same empire. One counted, the other compelled. Yet Thutmose's conquests did not simply enrich, they entangled. Tribute had to be enforced, rebellions smothered, successors prepared for a world where Ammonia's favor and chariot speed could not be separated. The wealth that poured into temples swelled priestly power, and the king's duty to Ammonius deepened in ceremonies that renewed his right to rule. Egypt's horizon had widened so far that a new problem emerged. Can a state built on balance, survive permanent expansion without losing its center? For now, the answer seemed yes, answered in granite and gold. But within a generation, a royal dreamer would tilt the sun's disk itself, and the empire would learn how fragile even disciplined geometry can be. Empire under Thutmose III was not raiding. It was geometry. Vassal rulers sent their sons to Egypt for education, hostages wrapped in etiquette, so that loyalty would be a habit learned in Karnak's courtyards. Garrisons and way stations pinned supply lines. Diplomatic marriages folded foreign princesses into the royal house, braiding bloodlines with treaties. At home, spoils funded expansions at Karnak. The festival hall, the parade of obelisks, pylons that turned processions into urban theater. Art reached crystalline brilliance. Reliefs snap with disciplined line, while in private tombs of officials at Thebes, painters froze moments of fishing, fowling, banquets with musicians, and scenes of captured animals cataloged with almost scientific curiosity. The scribe's palette and the archer's bow served the same empire. One counted, the other compelled. Yet Thutmose's conquests did not simply enrich, they entangled. Tribute had to be enforced, rebellions smothered, successors prepared for a world where Ammonia's favor and chariot speed could not be separated. The wealth that poured into temples swelled priestly power, and the king's duty to Ammonius deepened in ceremonies that renewed his right to rule. Egypt's horizon had widened so far that a new problem emerged. Can a state built on balance, survive permanent expansion without losing its center? For now, the answer seemed yes, answered in granite and gold. But within a generation, a royal dreamer would tilt the sun's disk itself, and the empire would learn how fragile even disciplined geometry can be. Before revolution, those radiants. Amenhotep III, the dazzling sun, presided over wealth so abundant that building felt like breathing. He raised palaces with lakes for royal boats, commissioned colossal statues whose serene faces he promised a king at ease, and showered temples from Memphis to Nubia with gifts. Internationally, this was an age of letters. The Amarna correspondence, archives of clay tablets written in Akkadian, the diplomacy language of the day. Kings of Babylon, Mitanni, Hutti, and vassal rulers in Canaan addressed Egypt as sibling and patron, bargaining for gold, brides, and favors with a tone that mixed flattery and complaint. These letters reveal a world of gift economies where lapis traveled farther than armies, and where a friendly reply could be as strategic as a fortress. At home, Amenhotep III cultivated a solar aura. Festivals of Aten, the sun disk, multiplied within an inclusive theology where Ammonius still reigned. Royal scarabs, oversized beetle amulets, broadcast news like ancient press releases, lion hunts, queenly honors, lake inaugurations. The queen, Tai, a formidable presence, partnered in ritual and perhaps in policy, her family connections linking the palace to a rising intellectual circle. Art softened, rounded cheeks, almond eyes, full lips, a grace that foreshadowed the even more fluid lines to come. Building campaigns, Luxor temple's colonnades, Ammonius courts, turned Thebes into a stage where the king's beauty and the god's favor reflected each other like mirrors catching noon. Yet brightness can bleach outlines. As Amenhotep III aged, his son, or co-regent, Amenhotep IV absorbed the solar focus but trimmed away the shadows. The court's confidence in divine intimacy, with a god that seemed less hidden and more immediate, prepared a pivot from an invisible Ammonius toward a visible Aten. It is tempting to read inevitability into the transition, better to sense possibility. A wealthy, letter-writing Egypt, sure of its civil servants and secure in its borders, felt safe enough to risk a theological experiment. That risk would redraw art, move the capital, and worry the army. But in this moment, of lakes sparkling, diplomats haggling for gold, and a queen whose name would be carved in cedar and stone, the empire hummed as if the sun itself had signed a long-term treaty with Thebes. Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and changed Egypt. He founded a new capital, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, on virgin ground, inscribing boundaries steely in cliffs like treaties with the horizon. There he directed worship toward the Aten, the sun disk whose rays end in open hands, blessing the royal family directly. Temples at Amarna were roofless, bathed in light. Altars multiplied in courtyards. Processions looped under the unblinking sky. The king in Nefertiti, his queen, appear in art with elongated heads, slender limbs, tender gestures, kissing children, sharing food, an intimacy that replaced the old granite distance with domestic warmth. Hymns to Aten praised daily creation. When the sun rises, flowers open. When it sets, the world sleeps. An elegant theology of immediacy. But monolatry, whether exclusive or merely jealous, rearranged power. Ammonius' priesthood, long entwined with administration, faced marginalization. Temples that anchored provincial economy saw their budgets yanked toward new city. Officials followed the king. Skeptics smiled thinly and complied. The international letters, now stored in the new capital, began to include cries for help from vassals in Canaan and Syria as rival powers nibbled at Egypt's web. Akhenaten's focus on cult, hymns, and urban art sometimes seemed to mute the empire's outer voice. Whether he ignored war or trusted generals to manage it, the perception remained. The sun's hands caressed the palace more readily than they grasped the reins abroad. At home, the artistic revolution scandalized some. Fleshy bellies, honest profiles, scenes of royal breath on common men, yet liberated others into a lyrical realism that captured movement like music. Akhenaten's sincerity is difficult to doubt, his judgment easier. By centering divine favor on the person of the royal family and flattening the pantheon's textured relationships, he narrowed the ways ordinary Egyptians felt seen by heaven. Protective household gods, motherly and toothy, had less liturgical room. Funerary texts were edited. The afterlife's robust geography dimmed before noon's radiance. His city thrived briefly, its villas and workshops buzzing, its scribes adapting to new epithets and rituals. But cities without deep roots can wither fast. After less than 2 decades, the experiment collapsed under the weight of practicality, military anxiety, economic strain, and popular piety's stubborn pluralism. Akhetaten would be abandoned, its sun-washed altars baking under the very rays they celebrated, while Thebes quietly reheated the old soup of Ammonius mysteries for a hungry nation. The pendulum swung back with a child. Tutankhaten took the throne and soon became Tutankhamen, a name change that said more than a policy paper. Ammonius is back. Edicts framed the restoration as healing. Temples ruined, or merely neglected, would be repaired, priesthoods restaffed, cult statues rededicated. The young king and his queen Ankhesenamen, likely Akhenaten's daughter, paraded devotion to Thebes while court artists blended Amarna's softness with classic forms, producing statues and reliefs of luminous grace. The army reasserted posture. Vassals received firmer replies. Yet Tut was a boy, and power pooled around older hands. I, a veteran courtier who briefly succeeded him, and Horemheb, a general whose patience would outlast them all. Tutankhamun's death spurred the making of an afterlife jewel. His tomb, modest for a king, was packed tight with splendor. Nested coffins, one solid gold. A mask whose cool gaze has hypnotized modern eyes. Chariots, games, linen, food, an inventory of life translated into eternity. The smallness of the rooms may reflect sudden death or political turbulence. The richness reflects a court determined to prove that restoration could still dress eternity properly. Meanwhile, Horemheb took the throne and cleaned house with legal reforms. His edicts, inscribed publicly, railed against corruption, theft of state property, and abuse by officials. He reorganized the army and administration, not as a pious poet but as a practical surgeon. He quarried Akhenaten's dismantled temples for building blocks, literally reusing the revolution as filler in the walls of a repaired order. The transition mattered. It taught Egypt how to digest a crisis. Restoration did not simply rewind, it blended. Artistic elegance from Amarna survived in gentle lines. A heightened awareness of royal image as intimate and human lingered in private tombs. But the theological center returned to plurality. Ammonia's chief among many. The afterlife's maps re-unrolled. Funerary books proliferated like travel guides revised after a detour. Abroad, Egypt stiffened posture, preparing for heavyweight contests with Hittites and for the grandiloquent age of Ramesses to come. The boy king whose fame now eclipses his brief reign became, in effect, a hinge between a sun-drunk experiment and a sober empire that had learned, at cost, that Mott requires balance not just in ethics, but in policy. His gold mask is beautiful. Yes, it is also a mirror in which a civilization saw both its fragility and its will to endure. Before the name Ramesses echoed across ages, there was Seti I, a soldier king who stitched discipline back into Egypt's frontiers after the Amarna turbulence and early restorations. Seti campaigned through Canaan and Syria, retaking towns, rebuilding roads, and refurbishing garrisons that had sagged during years of theological distraction and political rebalancing. His approach was method and mercy. Where obedience returned quickly, he confirmed local rulers. Where resistance persisted, he planted Egyptian officials like pegs along a map. Inscriptions at Karnak show Seti in austere relief, smiting enemies with the brisk certainty of a veteran quartermaster. He also built as if permanence were a virtue. At Abydos, he raised a temple of crystalline beauty, its halls lined with lists of earlier kings, curated memory, edited to present a clean lineage from mythic founders to the present. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also historiography, a disciplined attempt to remind a shaken world that Egypt remembered how to be itself. Into this house of order stepped his son, Ramesses II, who would rule longer than most empires keep their balance, around 66 years. From the start, Ramesses learned the dual grammar of Egyptian kingship, the spear and the chisel. He served as co-regent in his teens, appearing beside Seti in battle scenes, absorbing the rhythms of logistics, how to move grain, water, and bronze-tipped arrows across hostile ground, in a theater of power, how pylons, obelisks, and colossal statues speak to the heart of a crowd. When Seti died, the young king inherited an army that could march and a bureaucracy that could count. He also inherited a strategic situation like a chessboard at mid-game. Hittites in Anatolia had consolidated under a sharp leadership. Mitanni had faded. Syrian cities weighed tribute with a merchant's caution, and the Levant, as ever, tempted empires like a narrow bridge between seas. Ramesses took to the task with a showman's nerve and an engineer's patience. He founded a new delta city, Pyramus, a hub of stables, workshops, and palaces that anchored the army to fresh marshland arteries close to Asia. He amplified festivals in Thebes, even as he shifted some political magnetism north, balancing Ammonius' priesthood with his own household's gravity. Marriage diplomacy complemented troop movements. Foreign princesses entered the harem, knitting treaties into family dinners. The king's image multiplied. Colossi at Luxor, statues at Memphis, reliefs etched like headlines across temple walls, each carving a sentence in the long sermon of legitimacy. If earlier kings aimed for the measured elegance of chamber music, Ramesses composed in brass. Bold, repetitive themes, crescendos of stone, an argument that loudness itself could be a strategy when neighbors listened with spears. His domestic moves mattered as much as his foreign ones. Workshops scaled up production, arrows, chariot parts, linen for uniforms, bread molds for the army kitchens. The court refined reward culture. Gold collars, land parcels, and recorded honors kept officers loyal and craftsmen proud. Massive quarrying campaigns brought granite from Aswan and fine limestone from Tura, training a generation of masons who could turn sheer ambition into alignments you could measure with a shiny plumb line. In this climate, young architects, priests, scribes, and logisticians learned that to serve Ramesses was to think in big numbers and big gestures. The stage was set for the act that would define him, a battle whose outcome remained ambiguous, but whose story would be told and retold until the telling became the victory. The Battle of Kadesh, fought early in Ramesses II's reign against Muwatalli II of Hutti, deserves its fame not simply for chariots colliding on the Orontes, but for what came after, an arms race of storytelling, and eventually, the world's earliest surviving recorded peace treaty. The road to Kadesh was paved with intelligence failures and bravura. Ramesses advanced north in multiple divisions, confident and perhaps poorly briefed. Hittite scouts fed him a planted tale that the main enemy force was far away. Egyptian units stretched thin across a landscape of dust and rumor. The king's Ammonius division out ahead near Kadesh while other divisions lagged. Then the trap snapped. Hittite chariots, heavy, three-man platforms suited to shock, burst from behind the city, smashing into Egyptian camp and sending parts of the line into a maelstrom of panic and countercharge. Accounts carved in stone, Ramesses' poem and bulletin versions on temples from Abu Simbel to Thebes center the king in a glory halo. Abandoned by timid officers, he prays to Ammonius, rallies, mounts his chariot, and single-handedly shatters the foe, holding ground until reinforcements arrive. Hittite records, where they survive, present a different mood, a hard-fought engagement with gains and losses, after which neither side had the appetite or logistics to force a decision. Modern readings triangulate. Ramesses probably salvaged a near disaster through personal courage and late arriving troops. The Hittites retained Kadesh. Both sides bled enough to prefer pens to more spears. What matters just as much is that Ramesses then published the victory he needed. By blasting his version of events onto multiple monuments, he turned a strategic draw into a narrative triumph that echoed through centuries. In Egypt, to write was to create. He conjured prestige with hieroglyphs and limestone. Years later, pragmatism caught up with poetry, with other fronts demanding attention: internal balancing, Nubia, and shifting alliances in Anatolia. Egypt and Hutti formalized a peace treaty. Copies in both languages survive: the Hittite in cuneiform on clay, the Egyptian in hieroglyphs on temple walls. The document outlines mutual non-aggression, extradition of fugitives, and a vow of eternal friendship between great kings. It reads with startling modernity: clauses, reciprocal obligations, divine witnesses called to enforce compliance. Marriages followed. A Hittite princess joined Ramesses' court, and the careful choreography of gifts, letters, and ceremonial visits replaced the drumbeat of marching feet. The treaty did not erase rivalry, but it clarified rules and reduced surprises. For border towns and merchant caravans, such paper peace, etched in stone and baked in clay, meant seasons of relative predictability, which in an agrarian world is half of prosperity. Kadesh, then, is a hinge not because it crowned a victor, but because it midwifed a genre, the international treaty, and elevated state narrative to a weapon system alongside chariots. Ramesses learned that a monument could be a megaphone and that memory, tended well, pays political interest. He would apply the lesson lavishly. Wherever he built afterward, the walls remember his valor. Wherever scribes sharpened reeds, they copied his boasts. And yet, even as he embroidered victory into eternity, the king also demonstrated a grown-up realism, acknowledging limits, locking in peace, and pivoting resources to other theaters. A noisy campaign birthed a quiet stability. In that quiet, masons prepared blocks for a temple between cliffs far to the south where the sun, twice a year, would step inside to touch the king's carved face with a line of fire. No monarch understood the theater of sun and stone like Ramesses II. At Abu Simbel in Nubia, twin temples were hewn from living cliff. The great temple to Ahurti and the deified Ramesses, its facade dominated by four-seated colossi whose calm faces stare across a drowned landscape that modern engineers later moved block by numbered block to siphon the Nile's rising waters, and a smaller yet exquisite temple for Nefertari, beloved great royal wife, dedicated to Hathor, where the queen stands nearly equal in height to the king, a rare visual parody that reads as both affection and policy. Twice yearly, light penetrates the great temple to illuminate sculptures in the back sanctuary, a choreography of astronomy and architecture that turns sunrise into a ritual of kingship. Farther north at Thebes, the Ramesseum rose, his mortuary temple, its pylons once carrying versions of the Kadesh narrative, its courts littered now with fallen colossi whose broken knees whisper that even mountains can kneel when centuries pass. Ramesses multiplied presence. Additions at Karnak and Luxor, monuments at Memphis, chapels and statues along the Nile, and a capital at Pyramus that pulsed with chariot wheels, bronze casting, and diplomatic receptions. His household was vast. Many wives, dozens of children, and his affection for Nefertari and later queens shows in the pearls of love poetry tones that glow in some inscriptions. Tomb QV 66 for Nefertari in the Valley of the Queens, painted with saturated blues and luminous yellows, floats with hieroglyphs like musical notation, guiding her through the Book of the Dead's poetry. Art during his reign wielded scale as rhetoric and polish as persuasion. Tight-waisted charioteers, rippling horses, standard snapping like verbs in a sentence. Ordinary Egyptians felt the program in festivals that put gilded barks on the river and in taxes that made sure warehouses were never empty when masons called for rations. But greatness has gravity, and long reigns cast long shadows. The very success of Ramesses' patronage system swelled temple estates, particularly those of Ammonius, turning priesthoods into economic whales whose bellies contained fields, herds, and craft shops. Royal largesse ensured loyalty today, but diluted flexibility tomorrow, as land and labor shifted from the palace's direct hand to semi-autonomous sacred corporations. Military posts held, and the treaty guarded the northern horizon. Yet maintaining an empire of supply lines demanded unblinking attention, and age eventually bids even titans to blink. By the end of his reign, the world beyond Egypt stirred. Migrations, new iron technologies flickering on the edges, and neighbors rehearsing the maneuvers that, a generation later, would be summarized under the ominous shorthand Sea Peoples. Inside Egypt, we catch early murmurs of strain, ration delays, payroll grumbles among the skilled workers of Deir el-Medina, the village that built royal tombs. Hints that the distribution machine sometimes wheezed. Succession, too, became complicated in a palace as populous as a small city. Ramesses outlived many sons. The baton passed eventually to Merneptah, already seasoned but inheriting a ledger with tight margins. The old king's monuments kept speaking, but stone cannot issue emergency orders. After Ramesses' jawline ceased to glow in festival torches, officials had to translate his grandeur into solvency and security, and that is harder than carving a colossus. The twilight that followed was not collapse, but attrition. Border alerts more frequent, harvests not always perfect, priestly influence muscling into policy discussions, and a global system near a tipping point. And yet, even in the slow drift, the legacy of Ramesses burned on. A belief that architecture can argue, that treaties can tame rivals, and that a civilization's confidence, once taught, can carry it farther than a single lifetime, far enough to leave Futbur. Imagine dawn on the Nile floodplain, a ribbon of mist above irrigation basins, ibis lifting from reeds, and a low thrum of chores awakening in mud brick neighborhoods. Most Egyptians lived in 1- or 2-story houses built from sun-dried bricks made of Nile silt and chaff, the walls plastered and whitewashed to reflect heat. Layouts were practical, a raised threshold to keep sand out, a front room doubling as reception and workspace, a stair to a flat roof where people slept in summer, and small rear rooms for storage, grinding grain, or keeping a goat. Wealthier townhouses added airy reception halls with wooden columns painted to resemble bundled papyrus, cool cellars for beer jars, and private chapels with niches for household gods. Windows were small, high, and latticed. Light funneled through doorways and clear-story slits, keeping interiors dim and cool under the noon blaze. Streets tended to be narrow, more like corridors than avenues, shading pedestrians and channeling breezes. In planned towns, like those for pyramid workers or royal tomb artisans, rows of similar houses created an egalitarian rhythm, while elite officials carved off larger plots and enclosed gardens with ponds stocked with fish and ringed by sycamores or date palms. Inside, furniture was spare but clever. Low stools with woven rush seats, headrests carved in wood or ivory to cradle the neck at night, chests for linen and tools, reed mats for floors. Against whitewashed walls, a splash of color, lotus painted around a niche, or a door lintel inked with protective eyes, added warmth. Clés brasiers cimés stews, portable oven baquet bread. Roofs were workspaces too. Women aired laundry, dried dates, or laid fish to cure in the sun. Children watched kites wheel, while fathers patched nets or oiled tools. Water arrived in jars slung from wooden yokes, carried from neighborhood wells or canals. The day followed the river's metronome. In inundation season, many worked for the state in corvée crews, making levees and dredging channels. In sowing and harvest, entire families leaned into the soil. Domestic time braided with religious time. Little shrines on shelves house clay figures of protective deities, Bes with his tongue poked out to scare evil, or Tarit, the hippo goddess who guarded childbirth. Before leaving for fields, a short mutter of thanks, or a lamp lit at dusk, stitched the seen and unseen together. Social life thrived in thresholds and courtyards. Neighbors borrowed grindstones, shared gossip, and traded surplus onions for fish. Markets sprouted at crossroads or temple forecourts, where vendors hawked mangoes in later periods. But earlier the fare was dates, figs, onions, garlic, cucumbers, chickpeas, and baskets of barley. There, a fisherman's wife might swap a string of tilapia for linen thread, and a potter's girl would eye a pair of sandals cut from tan hide. The texture of life was not silence under pyramids, but the steady music of reciprocity. Favors owed, favors repaid, and a river that, if properly appeased and engineered, returned the investment with green fields and the promise of next year. Egypt tasted like bread and beer. Barley and emmer wheat were the staples. Families ground grain on saddle querns, a labor that fretted shoulder and elbow but fed empires. Dough, sometimes enriched with dates or honey, was shaped into conical loaves and baked upright against pottery cones or inside clay ovens, leaving a crusty tang that paired with stews of lentils, onions, and herbs. Beer, cloudy and nourishing, was not merely drink but food, brewed by partially baking a malty loaf, crumbling it into water, fermenting, straining, and sometimes sweetening with dates. Rations for workers were calculated in bread and beer units. A mason's daily wage could be a set number of loaves and jars, with extra for feast days or overtime on a rush job. In the kitchens of the better off, a cook might perfume lamb with coriander and cumin, or grill Nile perch over coals and finish it with a splash of sour pomegranate. In farmyards, clay jars lined walls like sentinels. Oils in one, pickles in another, clarified butter or rendered fat in a third, a few precious jars sealed with clay and stamped. Vegetables, relentless and honest, anchored the plate. Leeks, lettuce, radishes, and cucumbers with occasional surprises. Fenugreek greens, colocasia roots, young fava pods tender in spring. Fruit punctuated the seasons. Dates were year-round sugar. Figs collapsed into jammy sweetness. Sycamore figs offered a grainier chew. And in later eras, grapes fed both table and wine presses. Honey, prized and curated by beekeepers who moved hives to follow blooms, sweetened offerings to gods and desserts for humans. The phrase sweet as honey glued love poetry and bakery ledgers together. Spice routes widened flavors over time. Caraway, dill, and in the cosmopolitan ages, pepper and cinnamon flickered in elite kitchens like rumors turned edible. Meat was occasional for commoners, goat, fish, fowl, while elites staged banquets where roast beef ribs sprawled on silver, joints glazed and fanned with greens, and servants carved like choreographed dancers. Food mapped class and ritual. Temple kitchens fed gods first, figuratively by presenting dishes, then practically by redistributing to priestly staff and poor petitioners. Festival days pushed abundance into public squares. Beer flowed, grills smoked. Musicians spun rhythms while dancers cut time with sistrums and clapping hands. Even the dead ate, at least symbolically, through offering tables heaped with carved lists. 1,000 of bread, 1,000 of beer, 1,000 of oxen, 1,000 of fowl. Tomb scenes weren't diaries, but ideal menus, granting the justified deceased a perpetual cafeteria if descendants stayed dutiful. Recipes were technique more than text, memorized and muttered. How long to boil emmer to please your mother-in-law? which clay pot warms slow and steady, when to lift fish before it dries to leather. In the kitchen's modest theater, women and men in larger houses manage supply chains as deft as any vizier, turning grain into calories, into labor, into monuments. If pyramids were the visible outcome of state organization, bread and beer were its hidden engines. Quiet combustions that powered every pickaxe, reed pen, and prayer. Clothing in Egypt was a language of fiber and fold. Linen, flax spun into thread, ruled wardrobes from peasant to pharaoh. Working men wore simple kilts tied at the waist. Artisans added pleats or aprons. Officials introduced starch panels that proclaimed rank with geometry. Women's dresses varied from sheath-like tubes with shoulder straps to looser wraps and layered shawls, depending on era and class. In elite circles, pleating became sculpture. Accordion folds that caught light as the wearer walked, edges like the ripples of a slow canal. Linen could be so finely spun that a robe looked like captured air. In tomb art, transparent garments flirt with modesty and climate, revealing the practical truth of heat while celebrating the body's grace. Leather belts, beadwork collars, and gold-inlaid diadems punctuated outfits. Sandals of leather or woven papyrus carried feet through dust and court alike. Cosmetics were health and aesthetics at once. Coal, ground galena or malachite mixed with fats, ringed eyes to reduce glare and deter flies. Modern analysis suggests antimicrobial benefits too. Men and women alike lined lids. The black enhancing gaze in sun and shadow. The green echoing marsh life. Oils scented with myrrh or lotus soothed skin. Cones of perfumed fat perched on wigs in banquet scenes, melting slowly to release fragrance. Perhaps more symbolic in art than literal in life, but the point stands. Scent was social. Wigs, braided, curled, or close-cropped, managed heat and hygiene. Servants shaved heads for ease, while nobility donned tresses crafted like architecture. Jewelry carried amuletic charge. Amulets of Ujjad eyes, tie-at knots, and jed pillars mixed meaning with sparkle, promising health, protection, and stability on the body's living altar. Family life braided tenderness with duty. Marriages often began young by modern standards and were grounded in practicality and affection rather than rigid ceremony. Contracts managed property and inheritance, and women possessed notable legal agency. They could own land, sue in court, and sometimes run businesses. Domestic scenes in private tombs hum with music. Mothers handing toddlers figs, fathers fishing with kids, couples sharing a lotus bloom in a gesture that reads as a kiss in the language of flowers. Education started at home. Letters traced in dust with a finger, proverbs recited over porridge. Older siblings drafted into childcare and errands. Play was everywhere. Dolls with bead hair, ivory throw sticks for desert duck hunts, clay animals dragged on strings, knucklebones gambled over with laughter. Love poetry from the new kingdom survives like pressed petals. It is her voice that makes my heart live. These songs float between gardens and doorways, where flotation is as ordinary and as wondrous as sunrise. Fashion and family were not mere ornaments to high politics. They were the heartbeat under it, the culture that kept people willing to pay taxes, pull ropes, and endure heat because life, in its textures of linen and coal, song and stew, tasted worth the bargain. On a stony shelf above the west bank at Thebes lay Deir el-Medina, a purpose-built village for the artisans who carved and painted the pharaohs' tombs in the valley of the kings and queens. Here lived quarrymen with shoulders like door lintels, sculptors who could make a chisel whisper, draftsmen who grid walls with red and corrected in black, painters who shaded flesh with ochre and blue with lapis dream. and scribes who counted rations and copied prayers with a reed brush's patient scratch. Workdays marched to a disciplined beat. Crews crossed desert paths to cliffside gates, descended into cool corridors, and set to transforming raw limestone into the geometry of eternity. First came quarrying and smoothing. Then the draftsman's grid established proportion. Heads measured in fists, hands in canonical ticks, while story panels choreographed spells, rituals, and processions. Carvers followed, tracing drafts with relief that popped figures in a tactile life. Painters arrived last, laying down palettes that still glow through millennia of silence. Tools were simple and exquisite. Copper or bronze chisels hardened by hammering, dolerite pounders to rough out mass. Wooden mallets weighted just right in the palm, stone pallets worn smooth by years of grinding pigments. Light was precious. Lamps burned oil or animal fat with plant wicks, and smoke stained ceilings unless carefully vented. In the tight lungs of the mountain, work required rhythm. Periods of carving interleaved with rest, hydration, and jokes that scuffed the solemnity of death's architecture. Scribes tracked attendance with bureaucratic rigor. Who was present? Who was with his wife? Who was ill with scorpion? Who had brewed beer? Pay came largely as rations: loaves, beer, vegetables, sometimes meat, and as perquisites, cast-off jars, surplus wood, or a favor from an overseer. Skilled men could be proud and prickly. Their graffiti on cliff faces record prayers, boasts, caricatures of bosses, and naughty cartoons that remind us artisans are human across time. Tomb making was precision theater. Ceilings were star maps, a cosmos draped over the corridors. Pillars became bundles of reeds turned to stone. Sarcophagus chambers received texts like operating manuals for rebirth. The goal was coherence. Ritual scenes placed where the deceased would encounter them in the afterlife's journey. The sun boats, nightly passage tracked on walls. Guardians posted at doors with the correct names so the dead, rehearsed in life, could recite passwords in death. Quality demanded time, and time was politics. A long-reigning king warranted deeper corridors and more chambers. A sudden death forced triage, speeding decoration or reusing a prince's tomb for the crown corpse. When the work sang, think of the royal tombs at their peak. The effect is symphonic, color, line, and sacred speech welding architecture into a machine for immortality. Deir el-Medina made those machines, one steady day at a time, and in doing so forged a community identity as rich as any palace. Deir el-Medina was a village of contracts and customs. The state promised rations, the crews promised labor, the scribes promised to keep the ledger honest, overseers promised fairness and discipline. Law wasn't just top-down diktat, it lived in daily practice. Disputes over donkeys, arguments about fence lines, allegations of pilfered firewood, and claims for medical leave. Cases were heard before local councils, panels of senior workmen and a scribe, who weighed testimony, invoked Mot, and recorded judgments. Oaths were sworn by the pharaoh or by the god, and sometimes by the blade that carved the king's name, a reminder that tools could be sacred witnesses. Women appeared in records as complainants and litigants, asserting property rights or pressing charges in matters of marriage and inheritance. For an ancient society, this legal visibility was remarkable. It did not erase patriarchy, but gave women leverage and the paper trail to use it. Ration logistics were the village's lifeblood. When the system ran smoothly, jars of beer and sacks of grain arrived on schedule. When it hiccuped, morale dipped and tempers pricked. Shortfalls happened, flood anomalies, corruption upstream, or palace priorities siphoning stores. Out of such friction emerged an extraordinary event, a strike, one of the earliest recorded. The workmen, unpaid, down tools, marched to nearby temples, and staged sit-ins at sacred precincts, where their presence embarrassed officials and blocked ritual traffic. Their demands were simple: back rations, fairness, and their method was disciplined: petitions, not torches. Scribes documented each step, preserving a narrative of collective action that feels startlingly modern in tone. Eventually, officials paid arrears in bread and beer. The men returned to chisels, and the village's compact resumed. The strike revealed both fragility and resilience. The system could fail, but the workers had voice and leverage within norms of reverence. Justice also faced darker tests: tomb robbery, desperation mixed with opportunity, haunted the necropolis. Economic stress and knowledge of burial riches tempted some to tunnel into sealed chambers, pry gold from coffins, and melt sacred art into anonymous ingots. Investigations read like detective files, interrogations under oath, and sometimes under blows, inventories of recovered items, informers cutting deals, and lines of guilt crawling uncomfortably close to trusted circles. Courts punished harshly yet unevenly. Social rank and connections mattered, as they do in many ages. Through it all, the scribal hand kept writing. Who said what, which door sealed when, which lamp burned during a break-in, creating a paper city of accountability over the stone city of the dead. The very existence of such records is a kind of hope that even in stress, much could be restored by testimony, balance sheets, and the stubborn public memory of ink. While the artisans built royal afterlives, they also curated their own. Household shrines crowded with earthenware figures, best grinning, tar it heavy with protective might, and small stele engraved with prayers. I called to the god on my day of distress, and he came, reads a formulaic line that appears again and again, a humble theology of reciprocity more personal than temple pomp. Requests range from health for a child to success in litigation to relief from scorpion stings. Offerings were modest: beer, bread, a garland of lotus, or the promise of a vow fulfilled. Pilgrimages to local shrines punctuated weeks. A walk to a desert rock carved with a god's image, a ribbon tied, a name scratched in a stone to leave a trace. Religion here is not grand ideology. It's friendship rituals with the divine, a neighborhood diplomacy with powers that see and care. Ostraca, the broken pottery sherds that serve as notepads, preserve the village's comic relief and sharp intelligence. There are letters dashed off to borrow a cloak. School exercises where novice scribe wrestles with hieratic curves. Satires where animals act like humans. Cats waiting table for mice nobles. And frank erotic doodles that would make a priest cough and a crew laugh. There are also drafts of literary works. Hymns copied for practice, moral tales rehearsed, love poems smoothed into rhythm before performance at a small feast. Humor kept edges soft. A caricature of an overseer with a belly like a beer jar. A boast about hitting a chisel mark exactly like a falcon's eye. In this papyrus and clay archive, we meet people not as marble busts, but as neighbors. Proud of skill, tender with children, sharp in bargaining, occasionally petty, often generous. Ethics lived in small decisions. Returning a borrowed measure full, keeping a gate closed so goats don't ravage a neighbor's beans, sharing a jar on a hot march. The scribal school taught maxims. Do not move the boundary stone of a widow. That anchored law and empathy. Festivals refreshed the social glue. Processions where god images sailed on shoulders past doorways decked with flowers. Communal meals where even the quiet were invited to taste joy. Death wove through life without melodrama. Funerals were occasions for tears and pride. A good coffin painted with eyes. Linen bandages wrapped with care. friends speaking the name so the deceased would not starve in memory. Deir el-Medina's miracle is not perfection but articulation. It shows how a complex state touched private lives through rations, courts, and contracts, and how private lives answer with craft, prayer, laughter, and a stubborn commitment to fairness. In that dialogue between palace schedule and household shrine, Egypt's civilization achieved its distinctive poise, proving that pyramids are only the most visible tip of a mountain whose base is the ordinary virtue of millions. A temple in ancient Egypt was not only a place of worship, it was a machine that converted time, labor, and landscape into relationship with the divine. Egyptians called a temple the house of a god, and they built it like a city within walls. Massive pylons facing east to catch dawn, a paved processional court, hypostyle halls thick with columns like petrified papyrus stands, and inner sanctuaries where the deity's bark would rest and the cult statue receive offerings. The closer one moved toward the sanctuary, the darker and more exclusive the space became. Architectural theology made of shadows. Outside, magazines lined with storage bins held grain. Treasuries kept metal fittings, bolts of linen, incense, and rare oils. Workshops spun thread, carved furniture, and cast ritual implements. Temples owned fields and herds. They tracked harvests with a scribe's chill clarity. In inscriptions, gods eat first, symbolically through offering rites, and then the food re-enters circulation as wages to priests and rations to the needy. Thus, ritual redistributed wealth, turning cosmic duty into civic supply chains. Every morning, the daily cult reawakened the god. Priests purified themselves, opened sealed doors, and greeted the cult statue with hymns. They presented bread, beer, meat, fruit, and flowers. They anointed the god with oils and dressed the statue in fresh linen, as if attending a royal guest who never tires of courtesy. The statue did not come alive by theatrical trick. It was alive by consecration and continuity. After food and perfume, the bark might be carried in procession within the precinct or later in festivals beyond walls, where crowds glimpsed divinity behind portable shrines and cheered as if the heart of the cosmos had stopped by to check the neighborhood. Priestly ranks specialized. Wab priests for purity tasks, Hemnedger for core rites, lector priests who chanted texts with precise tones that were themselves instruments. Music, sistra, clappers, drums, beat time with incense smoke that drew geometry in air. Ritual was not spectacle for its own sake. It was maintenance, like re-greasing the axle of the world so it would keep turning without a scream. Temples also trained memory. Houses of life, scriptoria within precincts, taught scribes to copy hymns, myths, medical compendia, and mathematical problems. Here, the state's nervous system wrote itself new nerves. Festivals layered the calendar with pulse points. The Opet festival at Thebes transported Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu from Karnak to Luxor along an avenue of sphinxes, renewing royal legitimacy before city watching. The beautiful feast of the valley ferried god barks across the river to visit necropolis temples, binding the living and the dead into one strolling family. If the pharaoh was guarantor of Ma'at, the temple was the factory where Ma'at's products, justice, surplus, hope, were manufactured daily. Stone remembers this, but so did people. They knew the route by smell and drumbeat, and trusted that when the god turned a corner, blessings poured like cool water into a basin, each ripple reaching kitchens as well as chapels. Nowhere broadcast the scale of Egyptian piety like Karnak, a complex not so much built as grown, a sacred forest whose trunks are columns and whose canopy is a stone sky speckled with stars. Successive kings from the Middle Kingdom through the late period added pylons, courtyards, obelisks, and chapels dedicated to Omnisare, the hidden god whose breath was wind and whose will was order. The great hypostyle hall, with its 134 columns rising like papyrus bundles, choreographs light. Shafts pierce clear stories to paint hieroglyphs at certain hours, as if the sun were a lector priest reading walls. Outside Karnak's northern precinct lay a sacred lake used for priestly purification and to mirror constellations. Within, walls carry registers of victories, donation lists, and building boasts that entwine history and theology into a single vine. Karnak's power was not merely accumulation, it was alignment of architecture with solstices, of processional routes with civic need, of divine favor with royal propaganda. The temple complex made Thebes the capital of imagination, even when political centers shifted north. Pilgrims and kings alike came here to make true their desires in the god's presence. South along the Nile stood Luxor Temple, smaller but musically exact, a masterpiece in balance. Its axis bends slightly, a sacred misalignment that turns walking into revelation. One experiences sequence rather than a straight blast of grandeur. Luxor emphasized the king's birth and rejuvenation. Reliefs show Ammonius fathering the ruler, an old theological technology for new political needs. During the Opet festival, statues of Ammonius, Mut, and Consus sailed from Karnak to Luxor in gilded barks escorted by dancers and priests, then back again after days of ritual intimacy. The processional road, edged by ram-headed sphinxes, was a spinal cord of stone linking two brains. The administrative force of Karnak and the celebratory charisma of Luxor. In festival season, ordinary people surged along the route, snatching moments of nearness to divinity, making petitions and feasting under banners flapping like river flags. Sacred geography extended beyond city cores. On desert cliffs, royal mortuary temples faced the sunrise across fields, while in Nubia, temples like Amada, Salab, and later Abu Simbel stitched frontier to heartland with shared rites and iconography. Oases housed shrines whose murals adapted motifs to local light and sand. Border forts displayed chapels where soldiers asked protection before patrols. The land itself was a prayer book. The Nile's curve marked with sanctuaries like punctuation, deserts dotted with way shrines for caravanners, and holy sites where springs bubbled or meteorites fell. By placing temples at such nodes, Egyptians harnessed natural awe into ritual calendars. Travelers knew the map by story. Here Ammonius turned his face, their Hathor danced. At that bend, Osiris wept and the Nile's waters sweetened. In this landscape, walking was liturgy and cities were stanzas. You could read Egypt by moving through it, and every temple was a syllable in a language that praised sunrise as a political event. The priesthood's power was built on three pillars: ritual expertise, economic endowments, and popular trust. Over centuries, endowments swelled. Kings gifted fields, cattle, and workers to secure divine favor and to fund festivals that lent sparkle to their reigns. Temples became major employers, paying wages, commissioning art, and storing grain that steadied markets in hungry months. Priests, drawn from elite families, rotated through service cycles, maintaining purity rules, shaving, bathing, linen only, and mastering liturgies as intricate as architecture. This system worked when king and priesthood moved in step, but it also created political physics. As temple wealth grew, so did the temptation for priestly houses to nudge policy. At times of weak kingship or foreign rule, high priests, especially of Ammonius at Thebes, could act like quasi-kings, deploying or withholding ritual that legitimized rulers. Egyptian history includes episodes of reform or re-centralization to rebalance the equation. Some kings audited temple land, replaced high priests with loyalists, or built new cults that diluted Ammonia's hegemony. Thutmose III's devotion to Montu for martial symbolism, or later the Sate king's emphasis on Nephthys. The most radical move, of course, was Akhenaten's attempt to bypass the entire network by spotlighting Aten. Its failure reminded everyone that temples were not mere expense lines. They were embedded in local identity and daily welfare. More sustainable were policies like Horemheb's legal reforms, which punished officials for skimming offerings or abusing corvée workers, and Ramesses II's marriage diplomacy that satisfied Ammonius with monuments while quietly steering resources to his delta capital. In later centuries, under Libyan and Kushite dynasties, high priests married into royal lines, creating hybrid solutions where the state wore both crowns, pharaohs and pontiffs, on the same brow. Popular piety anchored all high maneuvering. If a priest proved arrogant or corrupt, locals grumbled, but they rarely rejected the god. They offered at household altars or walked to a neighboring shrine. The social contract was resilient because it was redundant. Many gods, many chapels, many routes to grace. Royal propaganda understood this and often cast the king not as temple rival, but as chief priest, a pious builder who restores what was in ruin. Ultimately, Egypt managed the temple-state tension by ritualizing it. The king presented Mot to the god in relief after relief, a carved reminder that truth and balance flowed both ways. When times were strong, that image felt descriptive. When weak, prescriptive. Either way, the cycle kept turning. Offerings in the dawn, audits at noon, and processions at dusk. A day's work for a civilization that believed eternity is just well-managed continuity. Egyptian science wore a clerk's tunic and carried a cord. The Harpadanapti, or rope stretchers, laid out fields after the flood, pulling a knotted rope to recreate boundaries erased by water. Geometry arose from this annual need. How to resquare a plot, how to calculate the area of a triangle where a canal cut a field, how to approximate a circle for a granary pit. Papyrus problems show practical elegance. Compute the volume of a cylindrical silo. Determine the slope of a pyramid. It's seeked as a ratio of run to rise measured in palms and fingers. Divide loaves fairly among workers with remainders converted into fractions of pleasing denominators. Egyptian fractions favored unit parts, 1/2, 1/3, 1/5, and scribes kept tables to decompose awkward shares into sums of unit fractions. It wasn't abstract algebra. It was applied ethics. Ensure fairness, minimize dispute, and keep the tax man happy. Surveyors worked with measuring rods, plumb bobs, and sighting tools that stabilized lines across shimmering heat. Builders translated geometry into stone, squaring foundations by the 3-4-5 triangle, aligning temples to cardinal points or heliacal risings, and managing tolerances tight enough to shame sloppy modern crews. At Saqqara and Giza, alignments with true north whisper of star work, observing circumpolar stars to fix the axis around which the sky appears to turn. Calendrical observation, the annual heliacal rising of Sirius, Sopdet, signaled the inundations approach, a natural clock for taxation and planting. Egyptian math lacked a symbol for zero, but it wielded place value logic in accounts and used doubling methods to multiply and divide quickly. Build a table of doubles and select lines that sum to your target. An algorithm scribbled in reed whispers. Knowledge moved in copybooks and on-the-job apprenticeship. A master scribe taught a junior to set up a word problem, to show work clearly, to check by inverse operations, and to present results with a modest flourish of found to be correct. This culture of proof by practice produced a civilization that could, century after century, deliver precise buildings, clean canals, and reliable rations with low technological drama. The genius here is not in a single eureka, but in institutional patience. The rope stretched, the lines checked, the counts verified, the records stored. In that discipline, the Egyptians built a quiet mathematics tuned to their river, predictable enough to trust, flexible enough to adapt, and moral enough to keep neighbors from killing one another over a furrow's width. Egyptian medicine combined close observation with ritual confidence. Medical papyri present case-by-case handbooks. If you examine a man with such and such swelling and it is hot to the touch, say, an ailment I will treat. Another case might end, an ailment not to be treated, revealing an honest triage that spared patients false hope and doctors' reputational harm. Practitioners recognized wounds, fractures, dislocations, infections, dental abscesses, parasitic complaints, and gynecological conditions. They set bones with splints, sutured lacerations with linen, applied honey, nature's antiseptic, to wounds, and used bread mold poultices that, by accident or experience, flirted with antibiotic effects. They irrigated eyes with mineral-based washes, massaged with oils, and prescribed fiber-rich diets for constipation born of bread-heavy meals. Some prescriptions read like kitchen experiments: ground carob, beer, cumin, measured with the precision of a scribe's temperament. Diagnosis used senses and time. Physicians palpated, listened to breathing, scrutinized color and odor, and then watched the course of days before revising treatment. They recognized patterns in pulse and urine, cataloged stages of inflammation, and warned against contaminated water. Gynecological texts discuss fertility tests, contraception attempts, and prenatal care with a frankness that suggests midwives and doctor priests collaborated in households and clinics tucked inside temple precincts. Surgery appears limited but present. Trepanations are rare, but reduction of dislocated shoulders and manipulation of joints read as everyday skills. Dental care was a losing battle. Sand and bread wore teeth to misery, but prosthetic toes and pads for corns demonstrate empathy and ingenuity. Ritual and incantation medicine wove through practice without paralyzing it. A doctor might apply a salve and speak a protective spell to enlist deities as allies, not substitutes for therapy. The goddess Sekhmet's temper, epidemics personified, was cooled by priests who both prayed and managed quarantine-like measures. Temple houses of life preserved anatomical lore in terms available to the age. Vessels carried air, blood, and breath magic around the body. The heart was the conscience seat, but the clinical tone of many texts remains startlingly modern in its humility before evidence. Egyptian medicine's achievement was not miracle cures. It was a socially trusted, relatively standardized care system embedded in religion, yet accountable to outcomes that households could judge. Did my child's fever fall? Can my husband grip his chisel again? On that practical scoreboard, the doctors of the Nile earned steady applause. Time in Egypt was a braid of cycles: solar year, lunar phases, and the Nile's pulse. The civil calendar standardized administration with 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 epigomenal days for the births of gods: Osiris, Horus, Seth, Isis, Nephthys, neatly packaging 365 days without leap year correction. Over centuries, this civil year drifted against the true solar year, but for taxes and schedules it worked. Predictability mattered more than astronomical perfection. Agricultural calendars overlaid the civil one in 3 seasons: Ake, inundation; Parate, emergence; and Shimu, harvest. Priests also tracked lunar months for certain feasts, weaving multiple clocks into a ritual fabric that kept festivals aligned with sky moods and field needs. The heliacal rising of Sirius behaved like a yearly alarm, announcing the water's return and the fiscal year's outset, linking stellar drama to sowing invoices. Daily hours were first qualitative: morning coolness, noon blaze, evening breeze, then quantified with shadow clocks and water clocks. A shadow clock, essentially a gnomon with marked scales, measured the movement of the sun across a calibrated bar. As the shadow crawled, priests timed prayers and officials paced work. Water clocks, or clepsydras, dripped at known rates from or into vessels with hour marks. At night, when the sun's rod sleeps, water's patience kept time for guard rotations and temple vigils. Meanwhile, astronomical ceilings in tombs and temples mapped decans, star groups rising at roughly 10-day intervals. To reckon hours after sunset, a sky logic that allowed night rituals to sync with heavenly choreography. Timekeeping served fairness, equal shifts, splendor, precisely timed processions, and science, predictable observations, enriching both the schedule and the soul. Philosophically, Egyptians held time as both linear and cyclical. Every sunrise repeats creation. Every reign renews kingship. Every festival reenacts myth. Yet individuals move from birth through judgment to an afterlife that depends on memory and ethics. This double vision produced a culture wary of hurry. Scribes praise patience, hot temper scatters, cool hand gathers, and builders preferred measures checked twice to deadlines met once. History, in their telling, was less a race than a maintenance plan for a delicate balance. By counting days with such layered instruments, sun, stars, water, ink, they taught themselves that accuracy is love made practical. To set a fair watch, to open a gate at the right dawn, to start harvest on the correct week so grain dries but does not shrivel. In Egypt, time was a temple too, and to keep it well was to worship. Egyptian art did not chase naturalism for its own sake. It pursued legibility and meaning. The human figure was built on a grid. Originally 18 fists from soles to hairline, later 21 or more, so that shoulders, elbows, navel, and knees landed on predictable lines. This canon made figures harmonize across centuries, like musicians reading the same key signature. Artists combined views for maximum clarity. Heads in profile to show nose and mouth, eyes frontal to reveal their power, shoulders square to display width, torsos twisting into a logic of visibility rather than anatomy. Far from incompetence, this composite view was a design choice that put communication first. When a king smites enemies, you must see the arm raised, the club arcing, and the foe's pleading hand, all readable at a glance in low light along a temple wall brushed by incense. Relief carving came in two main modes: raised relief, where the background is cut away and figures stand proud, catching light with crisp edges, and sunk relief, where lines are incised so shadow outlines remain visible even under harsh sun, ideal for exterior walls. Painters laid pigment on prepared plaster with a palette of mineral colors: red ochre for male skin tones, yellow for female in many periods, blue from azurite or imported lapis lazuli, green from malachite, black from carbon, white from gypsum. They built scenes in registers, horizontal bands that function like comic panels, organizing narratives of offering, hunting, banquets, or battle into clear sequences. Hieroglyphs intertwined with imagery, naming actors, labeling objects, and turning picture into text and text into picture. The result is a syntax. Figures speak, gestures are verbs, offerings are nouns stacked into abundance. and gods occupy larger scale because significance trumps literal size. Workshops trained apprentices by copying master outlines, practicing hands and feet endlessly until they could draw them with a single flowing line. Grids allowed multiple artists to collaborate on huge projects without losing proportion. A senior draftsman set the scheme, juniors filled in, carvers translated line into depth, and painters modulated hue. Innovation slipped in at the edges. Some eras favored delicacy over mass. Others shifted the grid's baseline to elongate figures into elegance or compress them into power. The canon was not a cage. It was a highway with lanes. Within it, artists found pathos in a tilt of a head, humor in a fishing cat pouncing, gravity in the jawline of a weary king. To modern eyes raised on perspective and realism, Egyptian art can seem formulaic until one learns to read its grammar. Then it unfolds as poetry, economical, musical, and alive to nuance. Art in Egypt flowed like the Nile through distinct banks. The Old Kingdom favored serenity, compact forms, cool idealism, faces composed like solved equations. Statues of nobles stare with alert calm, their inlaid eyes catching light as if thoughts flickered just beneath. Reliefs in mastabas show bakeries, breweries, and boatyards in orderly bustle, the world arranged as a machine that hums. The Middle Kingdom introduced introspection. Royal portraits sometimes show lined faces, heavy-lidded eyes, and a hint of care, as if kings wanted to advertise endurance more than youth. In private arts, wooden models of workshops, granaries, and boat crews multiplied, perhaps as efficient substitutes for painted scenes, turning tombs into miniature economies staffed by dolls with swinging arms. The New Kingdom burst with theatrical vigor. Thutmose III's age-etched crisp reliefs, horses taut as bowstrings, enemies tumbling in neat chaos. Hatshepsut's reign bathed walls in expedition scenes and botanical trophies, a gallery of trade turned myth. Then came Amarna, where Akhenaten's artists elongated skulls, softened bellies, and staged the royal family under Aten's rays with a tenderness rarely shown before. This stylistic swerve has been read as theological honesty. If Aten is immediate, art should be intimate. Drapery clung, faces curved, poses relaxed into daylight instead of marble-tough ceremony. After Amarna, a restoration blended its lyricism with classic canons. Tutankhamun's treasures glow with delicate inlay and elegant proportions, while Ramesses II's monuments roar with scale and repetition, a billboard strategy in stone. In a late period, archaism blossomed. Artists looked back to Old and Middle Kingdom models, reviving severe beauty as cultural ballast during politically windy centuries. Through all eras, craft perfection persisted in small things. Faience figurines glazed with blue like bottled sky. Shabby statues inscribed to answer for the dead in fields of eternity. Pectorals filigreed with gold wires so fine they read like handwriting. Painting practiced subtlety. The blue-green of marsh water, shading into brown, where mud shows through, fish scales dotted by a patient hand, grapes hanging in clusters with dots for bloom. The canon taught harmony. Fashion taught variation. When stylization is a choice rather than a limitation, it can carry entire metaphysics. Egyptians used it to argue that the world is knowable, ordered, and graced by forms that, when repeated with love, become prayers. Egyptian beauty was ethical. Mat, truth, balance, rightness, was not only a court principle or cosmic feather. It was an aesthetic measure. Proportion pleased because it echoed the river's discipline and the calendar's trustworthiness. Symmetry calmed because it resembled a king's two lands held in equal hands. Asymmetry, when used, punctuated like a festival day breaking routine. Colors carried metaphysics. Green meant growth and rebirth. Blue signaled sky and flood. Gold, untarnishing, was the flesh of gods. To gild a statue was not bling. It was a sentence about eternity written in metal. The act of carving hieroglyphs into a tomb doorway did more than decorate. It invited passersby to speak the name and thus perform charity for the dead, aesthetic as social welfare. Even blank space, carefully left, guided the eye like silence between drumbeats, making painted fields breathe. Scale functioned as theology. A god or king towers not because artists missaw humans, but because meaning weighs more than muscle. Egyptian viewers understood this instinctively. They lived in a world where the pharaoh's decision could flood a field with grain or collapse a village into debt. Large figures stabilized narratives like keystones. Smaller ones swarmed with life, providing context and chorus. In sculpture, the canonical left foot forward stance reads as readiness, not walking, poised stability rather than pursuit. Couples in tomb statuary often touch at the elbow or share a gentle clasp. Affection rendered dignified, a visual ethic that says intimacy and respect are not opposites. Animals are not mere props. They carry symbolic freight. Bulls for strength, cats for protective ferocity, geese for abundance, cobras for royal fire. Art also mediated memory. To erase a name or chisel out a face was to wound existence. To reinscribe was to heal. This belief gave curatorship moral stakes. Restoring paint on a relief was a liturgical act. Recarving titles after damnatio memoriae was repentance in stone. The canon's endurance becomes understandable. When beauty preserves being, conservatism is compassion. Yet within continuity, Egyptians found room for play. Musicians painted with swaying hips, dancers frozen mid-spin, a child tugging a papyrus skiff while a cat leans toward an unlucky fish. These aren't distractions from religion. They are its fruits, images that testify that a well-ordered world makes room for joy. In the end, Egyptian aesthetics teach that form is a promise. Keep the lines clean, the measures fair, the colors honest, and life will hold. That is why 3,000 years later, a single carved eye under a brow can still feel like a sunrise. Order awakening, looking back at us, and inviting us to stand a little straighter in our own brief corridors of time. Egypt breathed through corridors that stretched far beyond its deserts, lungs of trade that pulled in timber, metals, resins, and ideas, then exhaled linen, grain, and crafted prestige back across the Levant and into Africa. Northward, ships hugged the coast to Byblos, where cedar trees, tall, fragrant, and straight, became ship masts, palace beams, and temple roofs. The transaction was not just commodity for commodity. It was relationship layered in ceremony. Egyptian gifts of gold-inlaid pectorals and perfumed oils sweetened the deal, while Biblian rulers styled themselves as loyal sons of the pharaoh to lubricate deliveries during stormy seasons. Eastward, Sinai mines yielded copper and turquoise, wrested from barren hills by expeditionary crews guarded by soldiers and accompanied by scribes who recorded loads on ostraca, the state's small memory cards. Southward, Nubia shone with gold. Caravan trains and river convoys ferried nuggets and dust to Thebes, where temple treasuries learned the warm weight of empire. Farther still, down the Red Sea and along coasts that smelled of salt and wind, Egyptian ventures reached Punt, a half-legendary region of incense and ebony. Hatshepsut's reliefs make the journey feel like a perfume. Resin trees uprooted and carried home alive, exotic animals paraded as if the horizon itself had been domesticated. Commerce required choreography. Harbors had granaries and guards. Registrars weighed cargo with stone balances whose arms creaked like cautious birds. Inspectors stamped seals into wet clay to certify amphorae of oil or wine. In overland corridors, wells were milestones and garrisons punctuation, oases like hidden verbs making the sentence of travel intelligible. Risk management became culture. Sailors learned the moods of shoals and stars. Caravan bosses counted camels at dawn and at dusk, promising gods an extra lamp if the numbers matched. The state taxed lightly at choke points, but heavily at prestige. Foreign delegations paid in awe at Karnak's pylons and in tribute that funded more stone. Egyptians exported not only grain and cloth, but also reliability. Contracts honored, weights standardized, gods placated, so schedules kept faith. In return, they imported not merely objects, but architectures of possibility. Tall timbers that allowed wide halls, new metals that sharpened tools and spears, aromatic gums that turned rituals into theater. Trade widened the Egyptian imagination. Each cargo taught that the world was bigger than the Nile's banks, yet navigable if measured, sealed, and sung to with the right hymns at the right sandbar. Beyond markets loomed courts, and between courts ran letters. Tablets of clay incised with the spiky syllables of Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the late Bronze Age. In the Amarna letters, we hear kings flatter, chide, and negotiate like seasoned merchants of prestige. The king of Babylon writes as brother, asking for Egyptian gold and offering lapis as if swapping flavors at a royal tasting. Mitanni's ruler haggles over brides and dowries. How many chariots and horses accompany a princess? Are the promised gifts truly of first-rate workmanship? Or has an overconfident envoy padded the list with inferior wares? Vassal lords in Canaan complain that their neighbors steal grain or harbor rebels, pleading for archers the way a modern mayor might beg for extra police funding. Scribes replicate formulas meticulously, salutations stacked like ritual steps, gods invoked as witnesses, lists of gifts detailed to the last cup, as if the weight of promise depended on the weight of nouns. Diplomacy was theater with legal teeth. When words failed, treaties codified reality. After the bruising clash at Kadesh, Egypt and Hutti drafted a peace whose clauses read startlingly familiar. Mutual non-aggression, extradition of fugitives, guarantees for succession, curses for violators. The Egyptian version carved in hieroglyphs on temple walls was liturgical grandeur. The Hittite copy on clay smells of archives and damp rooms. Marriage alliances stitched the fabric. A Hittite princess crosses into Egypt with her dowry, and a scarab announcement circulates like a press release gilded with incense. Gifts after treaties are not bribes. They're circulatory medicine. Gold flows out to bring loyalty in. Lapis travels to warm a friend's pride, and letters shuttle to keep memory alive, so misunderstandings do not metastasize into skirmish. Interpreters and messengers were the veins of this system, their honesty a public good. To lie in translation was to gamble with borders. Behind the pomp stood logistics, stabled chariots, standardized messengers' way stations, and scribal schools that taught not only grammar but tone, when to be honey and when to be salt. Diplomats learned to read subtext in the material of gifts. A cup hammered too thin, says poverty. A statue with careless inlay, says disrespect. Egypt's advantage was consistency. Even when kings changed, temples kept continuity, priests witnessed treaties, and households remembered who had favored which marriage. Thus diplomacy in Egypt was not episodic. It was calendrical, a ritual circulation of tokens, and words that refreshed eyes like the Nile refreshed fields. Where spearheads could only threaten, clay tablets could bind, and Egyptians, masters of making stone speak, understood that sometimes the future hangs on the polite stubbornness of letters. Trade and treaties brought foreigners into Egypt not as curiosities, but as colleagues, soldiers, craftsmen, and, eventually, neighbors. Nubians served as archers renowned for precision. Asiatics, a catch-all for Levantine peoples, ran caravans, traded wines, and staffed garrisons. Libyans drifted east with herds, sometimes hired as mercenaries, sometimes settling in the western delta. Shurdin and other seafaring groups later fought for and against the pharaoh. In workmen's registers, we find foreign names adapted to Egyptian tongues. In art, we see tribute bearers depicted with care, beards, dress, and skin tones distinct yet rendered with the same sure line as Egyptians, a visual language that both differentiated and integrated. Delta towns grew polyglot. Pyramus sounded like a marketplace where commands barked in Egyptian were echoed in Levantine accents and perhaps answered in Nubian laughter. Cultural exchange moved quietly through kitchens and workshops. Foreign lutes and lyres enriched orchestra pits at banquets. Wine culture, with amphories stamped by distant estates, matured into a connoisseurship among the elite. New dog breeds trotted behind officials. Woven patterns and pottery shapes migrated like popular songs. Religion, too, proved hospitable. Deities such as Astarte, Kadesh, and Reshef entered the Egyptian pantheon's guest list, stationed at border fort chapels or celebrated in cities where soldiers needed battlefield patrons and lovers wanted charms that traveled well across languages. Egyptians did not surrender Ma'at to these newcomers. They domesticated them, placing foreign gods on pedestals inside Egyptian-style chapels, inscribing their names in hieroglyphs, and folding their myths into the local logic of balance and reciprocity. Identity in Egypt was practical before it was paranoid. People swore oaths to the pharaoh, paid rations in the right jars, and respected shrine calendars. Do that, and your accent mattered less than your reliability. Yet tensions surfaced when scarcity tightened. In the late New Kingdom, as global networks strained, foreign mercenaries could look like both shield and threat. Communities with different burial customs pricked anxieties about loyalty and afterlife etiquette. The state responded with paperwork, permits, rosters, and patrols, and with ceremony. Festivals where all could watch Ammonia's bark and remember that the river's order outranked clan quarrels. Over centuries, Egypt absorbed waves by giving them jobs and gods, then exporting back to those peoples an Egyptian style of legitimacy, temple facades, royal titulary, and a dream that order is achievable. In this way, Egypt lived not behind walls but across thresholds, its civilization a grand, negotiated household where guests were encouraged to wash, eat, and learn the house rules before joining the singing. The late Bronze Age was a web. Palaces trading daughters and cedar, scribes trading letters and seals, caravans trading tin for copper to make the bronze that made the swords that guarded the caravans. Then, within a century, the web frayed across the eastern Mediterranean. Drought patterns tortured harvests. Earthquakes nudged cities off their foundations. Routes once patrolled by confident kings saw bandits fatten and merchants thin. Into this turbulence moved peoples we group under the shorthand Sea Peoples, coalitions of migrants, raiders, and refugees whose boats knifed between islands and whose carts rolled along dried-out coasts. Some fled collapsed homelands. Others sought better pasture or plunder. Most did both. Letters from Levantine cities plead for help. Storehouses burned. Smoke became a dialect everyone understood. Egypt felt the tremor at its borders like a house hearing thieves test windows. Grain ships faced piracy. Vassal towns once loyal to Pharaoh now wrote with hedged praise. Desert routes required more spears than merchants liked to see. The Nile itself still flowed, but the international system that funneled cedar, horses, and goodwill into Egypt hiccuped dangerously. Inscriptions in the age of Merneptah record skirmishes. The famous Israel Stela mentions a people, not yet a kingdom, in Canaan, one sign among many that old political maps were smearing. Inside Egypt, ration schedules wobbled, and even in well-managed villages the ledger's neat lines began to look like wishful thinking. The civilization that had thrived on predictability met the most unpredictable of neighbors: weather, mass movement, and rumor. Scholars argue over which cause weighed most: the climate's cruelty, palace fragility, or raiding opportunism. But Egyptians faced the mix as they faced floods, with a blend of engineering and ritual, spears and prayers. Forts were provisioned and repaired. Coastal defenses tightened. Scouts watched channels where reeds could hide, or tips. Temples doubled down on festivals, not as escapism, but as social glue. In hard times, shared ritual keeps knives from pointing inward. The state's narrative recalibrated too. Smiting scenes on walls regained topical bite as kings presented themselves as bulwarks against chaos with human faces. The Bronze Age's grammar of exchange trailed into ellipses, and a new sentence, written in iron and migration, began. Egypt would not vanish, but it would speak more softly for a while, husbanding grain, repairing dignity, and learning to be careful in a rough neighborhood. When the wave hit hardest, Ramesses III stood at the seawall. Reliefs at Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple, stage a kinetic panorama. Ships locked prow to prow, Egyptian archers loosing from decks while marines with axes bored amid a tangle of oars. Ox-drawn carts rolling along the shore carrying families and tents. The migration baked into the battle itself. Captured foes with feathered or horned headdresses paraded as proof that the storm had been measured and checked. Ramesses boasts of crushing coalitions named in lists that read like thunder. Peleset, Tjeker, Shikalesh, Dinyan, Weshish. On land and sea, Egyptian tactics adapted. Fortified river mouths became traps. Archers used the Nile as ally. Chariots pivoted to protect infantry rather than just to chase glory across open plains. The state threw everything into the defense because everything was at stake. Fields, shrines, and the quiet domestic rhythms that make a civilization worth saving. Victory, while real, issued a bill. Campaigns devour rations. Defenses demand labor. Widows and wounded require care. After Medinet Habu's gleam, the ledgers grew grim. The artisans of Deir el-Medina, the crown's favored craftsmen, staged those recorded strikes when rations arrived late. Bread delayed, beer diluted, promises postponed. Tomb robberies flared, a symptom of cash crunch and moral fatigue. Investigations exposed networks that reached uncomfortably high, proof that scarcity erodes not only bellies but also boundaries. In art, Ramesses III's reliefs inflate victory because inflation of narrative is cheaper than a second army. In administration, Horemheb-style reform tones return in edicts, trying to plug the holes without stopping the river. Egypt held the line against the sea peoples better than many neighbors, and some of those groups settled upcoast in Canaan, where Philistines would soon stamp pottery with new motifs and cities with new names. But holding a line is not the same as holding momentum. Economically, Egypt pivoted inward, repairing canals, managing temple estates that had become emergency banks, and trimming the ambitions of distant garrisons. Diplomacy shrank to nearer horizons. Gift circuits thinned. The court's international swagger softened into provincial concerns. Religious conservatism grew attractive. Archaism in art and ritual promised continuity against a background of noise. Yet even in retrenchment, ingenuity survived. Farmers coaxed good yields from careful floodgates. Local workshops innovated small efficiencies. Village councils adjudicated disputes with stubborn fairness. The civilization's core competence, maintenance, endured. Medinet Habu's walls thus record not only a martial triumph, but also a civilizational choice. To be smaller, more cautious, and quietly resilient rather than spectacular and brittle. After Ramesses III, the new kingdom's machinery creaked, and Egypt slid into a third intermediate period that later chroniclers skimmed, but modern eyes find richly instructive. Power splintered. In the north, kings of late Ramesside lines and then Libyan-rooted dynasts held the delta, building at Tanis and other cities. In the south, high priests of Ammonius wielded near-royal authority from Thebes, their processions and endowments functioning like a parallel state with incense for coin and hymns for decrees. Marriage between priestly and royal houses attempted fusion. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it brewed rivalries as thick as date syrup. Local rulers in western oases and eastern frontiers exercised autonomy, striking deals with caravan chiefs who cared less who wore the double crown than whether wells were clean and tolls predictable. This mosaic did not mean cultural collapse. Art developed an archaizing elegance. Sculptors looked back to Old Kingdom serenity and Middle Kingdom gravitas, producing statues with tight lips and wise eyes that whispered, "We remember who we are." Temples remained engines of economy and identity. Their scriptorium runes copied old texts with devout exactitude, preserving hymns and medical recipes that might otherwise have vanished under sand and happenstance. Burials of the time, while humbler than past royal extravaganzas, achieved exquisite craft in coffins layered with protective vignettes painted in jeweled tones on a ground of luminous yellow. Nested sets turned the deceased into a portable chapel of theology. In Thebes' cliffs, the so-called cachettes gathered reburied royal mummies rescued from looters and rewrapped by pious priests. An act of cultural triage that saved faces and names for modern eyes to meet. Politics under Libyan chiefs produced innovations in administration. Local chieftaincies organized by great chiefs of the Meshwesh, scribal families accruing power over generations, and military colonies settled with foreign troops who became Egyptian by pace cycle and prayer habit. The price of fragmentation was strategic vulnerability. The benefit was flexibility. Egypt learned to live as a federation of interests moderated by memory. When foreign empires knocked, Assyrians would, and later Persians, the country would bend, sometimes deeply, but fibers of custom, law courts, village piety, and temple routines kept identity from tearing. The rivers still rose. Festivals still walked avenues of sphinxes. Mothers still lined eyes with coal in morning light. In that routine lay a genius for survival. The Bronze Age had collapsed. Egypt, less imperial but still intensely itself, waited for fresh winds from Nubia and the delta that would briefly hoist its sails again. South of Egypt, beyond the First Cataract, the kingdom of Kush had long watched the Nile's great neighbor with a mixture of rivalry, reverence, and family resemblance. At Napata, in the shadow of Jebel Barkal, a sandstone mountain shaped like a rearing cobra, Kushite kings curated an archive of Egyptian ritual, language, and style that earlier empires had exported along with garrisons and trade posts. Temples to Ammonius rose there with columns and pylons echoing Thebes, priests memorized hymns in Egyptian. Royal names drew from pharaonic titulary. Over centuries, as Egypt's new kingdom withdrew and the Third Intermediate Period splintered authority between Delta dynasts and Theban high priests, the Kushites developed a conviction that their stewardship of Ammonius cult was not imitation but inheritance. If Egypt had misplaced Ma'at in the noise of competing thrones, perhaps the South, custodian of an older fire, could relight the torch. Enter Pi, often called Pianki, a Kushite king whose inscriptions read like a sermon in granite. He received reports from the north that Delta lords bickered and that Thebes needed a protector who did more than recite pieties. Pi marched north in a campaign framed not as conquest for plunder, but as pilgrimage for order. His victory stela speaks with unusual intimacy. He bathes, he prays to Ammonius. He rejects meat prepared by Egyptians he deems impure. He tours captured towns and insists on proper ritual before accepting surrender. At Memphis, he besieges and negotiates. In Thebes, he recenters cult, saluting the god as father and judge. The text breathes a theology of kingship. The legitimate ruler is the one who keeps the god's house clean and the canals honest. Pi refuses to reside permanently in the north. He returns to Napata, content to knit Egypt's crowns under Kushite guidance, while signaling that sovereignty's true pivot is the temple, not the palace. Kushite statecraft fused piety with policy. Their court presented itself as the restorer of ancestral norms rather than as a foreign novelty. They preserved Egyptian artistic canons while introducing Nubian accents. Royal portraits with full lips and broad noses, granite statues with coiled power in the shoulders, and pyramid burials at El Kuru and later Nuri that reinterpreted Old Kingdom geometry at Nubian scale. Administration leaned on Theban priesthoods but trimmed their autonomy, placing trusted kin in key offices and reinforcing Nabonidus theology as the ideological spine linking cataracts to delta marshes. The commoner in Middle Egypt might not have cared which house printed the tax receipt, so long as grain measures were fair and festivals walked on time. The Kushites understood this and invested in the optics and the logistics of continuity, processions, repairs of neglected shrines, and a rhetoric of purification that comforted a public weary of improvisation. Trade routes benefited. Nubian gold, always a decisive ingredient in Egyptian power, now flowed under friendly management. Ivory, ebony, and livestock from deeper Africa threaded through Napata toward Memphis, while Egyptian linen, faience, and bureaucratic know-how moved south. In this two-way current, both polities grew more themselves by embracing the other. Kush burnished its cosmopolitan credentials. Egypt rediscovered its southern roots. The fusion did not erase tensions. Delta warlords remembered their own ambitions, and foreign empires watched with interest. But for a luminous generation, the Nile sounded like one river again. The promise of the 25th dynasty was not flashy expansion. It was reverent repair, a claim that to go forward, sometimes you must walk backward carefully, step into the footprints of ancestors, and then add your own stride where the trail resumes. After Pi's statement of intent, his relative Shabaka consolidated Kushite rule in Egypt proper. Legends later credit him with the Shabaka stone, a text preserving archaic theology, taught crafting the world through heart and tongue, that fits the dynasty's mood of curated classicism. Whether copying older papyri or reasserting Memphis' priestly prestige, the message was clear. The Kushites were librarians of eternity as well as generals. They refurbished temples at Karnak and Luxor, endowed priesthood strategically, and sat for sculptures of magnetic presence, dark granite kings whose gaze seems to weigh a visitor's honesty. Shabitku continued the course. And then came Taharqa, the dynasty's great builder, whose name is stamped on colonnades and shrines from Nubia to the Delta. He restored processional ways, erected kiosks, and planted himself in relief after relief as the kneeling servant of Ammonius, pouring libations with hands that also held the reins of horses trained for Syrian-style chariotry. But while Kushite Egypt looked inward to polished tradition, the Near East convulsed under the rise of Assyria, an ironclad empire with siege engines, seasoned infantry, and a policy of remorseless audit. Assyrian kings like Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal alternated between courtly letters and cold campaigns, pressing their web deeper into Syria-Palestine. Egypt's old Levantine buffer became a chessboard crowded with desperate vassals and ambitious conquerors. Taharqa supported anti-Assyrian coalitions in Judah and Philistia, seeing alliance not only as geopolitics, but as moral duty to shield temples and trade routes from a power that boasted of flaying rebels and paving routes with deportees. Assyria struck back. Esarhaddon marched to the Nile Delta, and, in inscriptions proud with cruelty, claimed to have captured Memphis. He installed vassals and arranged tribute. Taharqa retreated south, regrouped, and reappeared. The seesaw continued, with Ashurbanipal later boasting of further victories and of installing Necho from a Sate house in the western delta as a loyal strongman. The Assyrian storm did more than bruise pride. It shook the logistics of kingship. Garrisons needed pay, canals needed dredging, diplomacy needed silver tongues and patience. Kushite policy tilted between resistance and accommodation, choosing battles like an archer picking targets in a dusty wind. Even in adversity, the dynasty's cultural program thrived. At Gebel Barkal, Taharqa's monuments married Nubian landscape to Egyptian liturgy. In Thebes, festivals pulsed with renewed vigor, as if the more the frontiers groaned, the more the center sang. Yet the strategic reality hardened. The delta was hard to hold against Assyrian supply lines running from fortified hubs in Syria. Local princes hedged bets with double pledges, and Thebes, though spiritually mighty, sat far from the front. Ultimately, the 25th dynasty ceded Egypt to a new configuration, not cultural defeat, but political displacement. The Kushite kings withdrew fully to Nubia, where their line continued for centuries at Meroe, innovating with iron, pyramids of unique slenderness, and a lively writing system. Even as Egypt proper pivoted toward a Sate renaissance grounded in the western delta's marshy pragmatism. From Sais in the western delta emerged Psamtik I, Psammeticus, a prince whom Assyrians first favored as a vassal, but who proved too skillful to remain anyone's puppet. He stitched Egypt together with a seamster's patience, courting Theban priests with deference, reigning in fractious delta lords with rewards and quiet pressure, and recruiting Greek and Carian mercenaries to stiffen garrisons while keeping native troops fed and proud. His regime cultivated an image of sober restoration, law courts trimmed of corruption, canals re-excavated, and taxes standardized. Art pivoted into refined archaism. Sculptors studied museum pieces, some literally exhumed, to recapture old and middle kingdom serenity, producing statues with tight-lipped composure and elegant proportions that read as cultural confidence rather than mere nostalgia. In this deliberate look back, Sate Egypt found a way forward. If memory is well managed, it becomes a resource, not an anchor. Economically, Psamtik opened and organized the delta's seaward face. At Naucrates, he sanctioned a Greek trading emporium where Ionian and Aeolian merchants kept houses, temples, and warehouses, an officially recognized enclave that converted Mediterranean curiosity into taxable, manageable traffic. Egyptian grain flowed out. Wines, oils, fine wares, and ideas flowed in. The court played host like an experienced innkeeper. Foreigners could worship in their own styles on allotted plots, but contracts, measures, and policing answered to pharaonic law. This careful cosmopolitanism paid off in revenues, and in a pool of skilled mercenaries and pilots useful for campaigns or canal digs. Necho II, Psamtik's son, pursued bolder projects, an attempted canal linking Nile to the Red Sea and a naval policy that read the Mediterranean like a new kind of Nile. He meddled in Levantine wars and famously crossed paths with Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon at Carchemish, where Egyptian ambitions checked hard against Mesopotamian reality. Later Sate kings navigated between Babylonian pressure and Greek entanglements. Apries, Wahiber, tangled in Levantine politics and lost face at home. Amasis, almost too, restored stability with peasant humor and shrewd diplomacy. Greek sources paint Amasis as convivial and crafty, a man who drank with sailors and negotiated with tyrants, while Egyptian records show a builder who adorned Sais, supported temples across the land, and maintained the archaizing arts at high polish. Under the Sates, craft industries thrived, bronze casting of divine images, linen weaving that drew compliments abroad, and faience that glazed shelves with the Nile's captured blue. Court workshops produced sarcophagi and statues whose surfaces feel like silk turned to stone, inscriptions crisp enough to please priests and pretty enough to charm merchants with a taste for souvenirs. Law codes and teaching texts circulated with renewed vigor in schools that saw their mission as national therapy. Copy the past correctly, and the future will behave. Yet the eastern horizon darkened. Persia under Cyrus and later Cambyses assembled an empire with cavalry punch, administrative flexibility, and propaganda of tolerance sharp enough to pry open city gates. Egypt watched alliances churn in the Levant and counted spears. Amasis died as clouds gathered. His successor, Psamtik III, faced the test and failed under Cambyses' weight. Pelusium fell. Memphis submitted. Egypt entered a new frame as a satrapy under the Achaemenids. But the Sate contribution endured. Administrative tidiness, a cosmopolitan delta that had learned to talk to the sea, and a canon of graceful archaism that permanently reset Egypt's self-image. Even when Persian governors sat in Memphis, sculptors still carved as if Ptah's breath hung in the workshop, and scribes still wrote as if Thoth would grade their margins. The Sate century taught a durable lesson in cultural judo. When geopolitics turns rough, lean back on excellence, host wisely, and make memory pay the bills. When Cambyses II crossed into the Delta in 525 BCE and defeated Psamtik III near Pelusium, Egypt entered the Achaemenid world, an empire of couriers, roads, and pragmata paperwork that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. Conquest cut deep, but the Persians did not aim to erase Egypt. They meant to integrate it. Egypt became a satrapy, its taxes assessed by imperial accountants, its grain tallied not only for local consumption, but for distant garrisons. Persian kings took traditional pharaonic titles in official contexts and made offerings to Egyptian gods, a political bilingualism that said, "We rule, but we understand that order here is spelled with mot." Under Darius I, the administration tightened and also invested. The old dream of linking the Nile to the Red Sea via canal resumed, with inscriptions in multiple scripts boasting of a water road where ships could sail from Egypt to Persia. This was not mere vanity. It was logistics turned theology. If the world is one empire, let its waters touch. The Achaemenid toolkit combined tolerance with surveillance. In temples, priestly hierarchies continued their rhythms. Festivals kept calendars honest. Houses of life, still copied hymns and medical treatises. But satraps audited temple lands, and imperial inspectors, the king's eyes and ears, sniffed out fraud. Law grew multilingual. In villages, Demotic, the streamlined descendant of Hieratratic, handled contracts, loans, marriage settlements, and court minutes with a brisk, practical tone. In chancelleries and along trade routes, Aramaic served as the empire's duct tape of communication, pinning distant towns to the royal center. Egyptian scribes who learned Aramaic found their careers widened. Papyri carry parallel scripts like twin oars pulling the same boat. Coinage arrived with a new consistency. The sight of Persian derricks and sigloi, alongside local issues, taught markets to think in metal as well as in barley. For a society that had long thrived on measured continuity, the Achaemenid system felt oddly familiar in its love of lists. Only the god at the top had changed address. Religion absorbed and parried. Persian rulers patronized major shrines, repaired walls, and sometimes presented themselves in relief as proper donors to Neith, Ptah, or Ammonius, even while their own imperial ideology whispered of Ahura Mazda and the king's righteousness. Egyptians, masters of syncretism, read such gestures as signs that the universe still recognized the Nile's grammar. In art, a tasteful archaism persisted. Statues modeled on old kingdom poise, inscriptions carefully carved as if each sign were a bead on a rosary of identity. In the countryside, farmers measured fields after the flood as always. In garrisons, Persian officers drilled with discipline that impressed even skeptical locals. Stories later painted Cambyses as a sacrilegious madman. The record is more mixed. Abuses happened, reformers followed, and the machine kept grinding. For ordinary people, the empire was judged not by cuneiform boasts, but by whether temple granaries opened in lean months and whether court scribes recorded verdicts fairly. By that scoreboard, the first Persian century in Egypt delivered a stern but workable normal. Foreign caps on officials, familiar gods and sanctuaries, and a sense that the world had grown larger without the Nile ceasing to be the world's best teacher of habit. Empire invites resistance like spring invites weeds. In the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Egypt saw revolts flare under native kings who briefly shook off Persian control. Amartius of Sais, the lone ruler of the 28th dynasty, followed by Delta dynasts in the 29th and 30th dynasties who played Greek city-states and Persian factions against one another with nimble diplomacy. Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II, the last native pharaohs, built energetically. Temples at Philae, Hermopolis, and Saqqara, and hired Greek mercenaries in numbers that transformed garrisons into small international schools of tactics and slang. The delta bristled with forts. Canals were both arteries and moats. Priests wrote hymns that sounded like legal briefs to the gods, reminding them of vows to protect Egypt if humans kept offerings punctual. For a shining moment, the country felt sovereign again, a carefully tuned instrument played by kings who knew both the old music of Mot and the new rhythm of hoplite shields. Parallel to swords, scripts advanced. Demotic blossomed as a civilian tool of astonishing range, wills dividing date palms with exact trees named. Apprenticeship contracts specifying how many seasons a youth owed in a goldsmith shop. Petitions to officials lovable in their insistence that justice is a daily bread. Temple loans collateralized against cattle and jars. These documents read like voices across a counter, quick, precise, sometimes cranky, showing a society that translated ancient ethics into contemporary bureaucracy. Greek inscriptions began to pepper stones more densely. Dedications by mercenary officers to local gods, graffiti by sailors, and in Naucratis and Memphis, Bilingual stele that reveal a cosmopolitan street where market arithmetic moved between alphabets with ease. Egyptians could be pragmatic polyglots. Speak Demotic to your mother, Greek to the quartermaster, and a language of ritual to the god who, after all, speaks balance in every tongue. Persia returned under Artaxerxes III, whose reconquest was brutal enough for memories to sour. Temples were taxed hard, rebellious towns punished, and garrisons tightened. Yet even this second Persian period could not erase the administrative ecosystem Egypt had become. The very act of taxing required local scribes. The very need to calm the countryside required temple cooperation. The very wish to join the empire's arteries required mending Egypt's own canals and roads. Think of this epic as a laboratory for translation in the broad sense, of ideas, institutions, and identities. Egypt learned to move between centers of power while keeping its own center in reach. When Alexander of Macedon later sprinted through Persia's provinces like a young storm, Egypt, long experienced at surviving foreign weather, would greet him as both conqueror and opportunity, a chance to anchor Greek ambition and Nile wisdom, and to reinvent kingship yet again without abandoning its one sacred obligation, to keep mornings predictable for the people who bake the bread. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great marched into Egypt and met a reception that was tactically submissive and symbolically charged. Persians had worn out their welcome. Memphis opened its gates. Priests, experts at reading tides of fortune, anointed the Macedonian as Pharaoh, a son of Ammonius in the old idiom. Alexander staged piety with flair. He traveled west to the Oracle of Siwa in the Libyan desert, a shrine where Ammonius spoke in whispers of wind and priestly interpretation. What was said is debated. What mattered was the narrative, that the god recognized Alexander as legitimate, even divine in some sense, and that the conqueror left convinced he could graft his world empire onto Egypt's sacred trunk. In the choreography of kingship, few steps are as effective as getting the oldest gods to nod. The visit sealed a pact between Greek charisma and Egyptian permanence. On Egypt's Mediterranean lip, Alexander drew lines in sand and declared a city, Alexandria. He chose a site between lake and sea, near the island of Pharos, where a future lighthouse would lift fire to the clouds. The urban plan, streets at right angles, a grand longitudinal avenue, quarters for Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and others, announced a new kind of Nile mouth. Not a marsh of shifting reeds, but a grid for mixing cultures. The harbor would gulp ships from across the Mediterranean. Canals would yoke the city to the river's grain. Warehouses would pile amphorae like terracotta books in a library of appetite. Egypt's old strengths served the new project. Predictable harvests to feed imperial armies and urban markets. Scribal expertise to run customs and courts. Temples skilled at hosting foreign gods, so civic peace felt natural. In this lattice, the future library and museum, a scholarly community more than a public building at first, would take root, turning curiosity into statecraft and making learning itself a crown jewel of legitimacy. Alexander did not stay. Eastern wars called, and death took him young. But his lieutenants understood the value of Egypt as both breadbasket and brand. Ptolemy, savvy among the Dattakai, would secure the land and its story, placing Alexander's body in Alexandria as a saintly magnet and rewriting kingship as a duet between Greek and Egyptian idioms. Before that chapter opens, notice what the Achaemenid and Macedonian moments had already accomplished. They had taught Egypt to be at home in empires, to translate rituals into diplomacy, and to convert local genius into global capital. Siwa's oracle symbolized that fusion, a desert whisper becoming a world proclamation. Along the quay where fishermen mended nets in the salt wind, boys would soon hear many tongues and learn that being Egyptian now included being cosmopolitan and inland, under sycamores where mothers lined eyes with coal at dawn. The old pact endured. Keep Mott, keep canals and contracts honest, and the gods, whether called Ammonius, Zeus Ammon, or by names yet to arrive, will keep the sun on schedule. When Alexander's sudden death shattered his empire into contested shards, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, made the shrewdest grab. Not the most territory, but the best. Egypt, with its calendar of grain and its old genius for bureaucracy. At first he held the land as satrap, testing alliances with other Daedikai, while quietly shaping a throne that would fit only him. He understood the Nile's arithmetic: control the harvest, honor the temples, pay the army on time, and advertise stability so loudly that traders and scholars sail toward the noise. He brought Alexander's body to Egypt, political relic and talisman, and let rumor braid divinity around the new capital's name. Under Ptolemy Isoter and his heir Ptolemy II Philadelphus, Alexandria became a project as much as a city, a geometry of avenues and harbors designed to make the sea and river shake hands, then trade favors. Administration learned to speak two languages at once. In the Greek-speaking court and chancery, the king was a Basilius who issued decrees, minted coins, and played Mediterranean diplomacy like a chess clock. In the Egyptian countryside, he was a pharaoh whose cartouche appeared in temples, who offered Mott to Ammonius, and whose festivals reassured farmers that the gods had not been evicted by foreign accents. Ptolemaic scribes did not erase native offices. They co-opted them. Demotic contracts still tracked leases and loans. Village chiefs still watched canals and field edges like hawks. Temple estates still employed bakers and herdsmen. Over this local web, the dynasty draped a revenue system that counted in coin as well as barley, encouraging markets to think in silver while never abandoning the old habit of paying workers in bread and beer where coinage ran thin. Symbols matter in new regimes. Ptolemy launched a cult that was both Greek and Egyptian. Serapis, a god with Hellenic beard and Egyptian power, enthroned in a grand serapeum that nodded to Memphis while facing the sea. He and his successor seeded Alexandria with civic temples, gymnasia, and a royal quarter whose palaces winked at ships with terraces and bright stone. Pharos, the lighthouse begun under Ptolemy I and completed under Ptolemy II, rose like a promise kept, its fires and polished mirrors turning night into a navigational text. Merchants learned to trust that light, captains to trust the customs house behind it. Meanwhile, in the Fayum, land reclamation and resettlement schemes brought Greek veterans and entrepreneurs into a patchwork with Egyptian villagers, creating towns where olive presses clicked beside shrines to crocodile gods, and where a Greek tax form might be answered with a demotic receipt signed by a local scribe who knew every irrigated furrow by nickname. Court culture advertised abundance and order. Processions glittered with gilded barges and aromatic clouds. Coin portraits spread the royal jawline across markets from Cyrene to Cyprus. Marriage policies kept the dynasty tight, too tight sometimes, while diplomatic letters oiled commerce. But the core achievement was infrastructural. Harbors dredged, warehouses multiplied, an army of clerks trained to tabulate oil quotas and papyrus shipments, and a legal mosaic that allowed disputes to be heard in Greek courts or Egyptian forums, depending on the parties and the problem. The Ptolemaic bet was simple. If you compress the world's curiosity, hunger, and ambition into one city with reliable schedules and good gossip, wealth and legitimacy will circulate like arterial blood. Alexandria was that beating heart. Egypt, the muscle body that pumped it. Ptolemy I and II built not only granaries and fleets, but an institution that turned curiosity into policy. The Mouse Ion Museum, a community of scholars with stipends, dining halls, gardens, lecture spaces, and its book hoarding partner, the library. Imagine colonnades where murmured Greek and Egyptian mingle with the scratch of reed pens on smooth papyrus. Storerooms where rolls lie in pigeonhole racks labeled by author and genre. Courtyards where astronomers compare notes with anatomists and poets intercept them with a new hymn. The kings gave the scholars salaries, tax exemptions, and a mandate: collect everything. Ships docking at Alexandria had their books seized, copied, and returned. Sometimes the copy, sometimes the original. Private libraries recorded. Distant courts coaxed into sending texts. Ambition was encyclopedic before the word existed. Inside the stacks, the idea of organization became a science. Callimachus compiled the Penox, a vast catalog that mapped authors, works, incipits, and subjects. A database on papyrus, without electricity, but with the same hunger for metadata that drives modern search. Xenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus honed philology to a razor, standardizing Homer with critical signs, sorting variants, and teaching that precision is love's twin. In geometry, Euclid's elements turned intuitive lines and angles into a deductive cathedral, proof stacked on lemma like fine ashlar under a level. Eratosthenes, librarian and polymath, measured the Earth's circumference with shadows and cleverness, then drew a map that admitted rivers and mountains into reason's grid. In medicine, Herophilus and Erasistratus at nearby research centers dissected human bodies, a scandal to some, tracing nerves and vessels with courage and method. While in mechanics, visitors like Archimedes traded problems and devices, their letters a string of brain fire across seas. The library was also a theater of translation. Under Ptolemy II, the court sponsored a Greek rendering of Hebrew scriptures, the Septuagint, for the large Jewish community in Alexandria, showing how a city of ports can dock ideas as deftly as ships. Grammar, lexicography, chronology, and textual criticism flourished because the book had become both mirror and weapon. To control the version of a text that scholars teach is to control the story nations tell themselves. Papyrus manufacturing, cut, soaked, pressed, dried into pale sheets, fed this hunger. Scribes developed book hands that balanced speed with elegance. Correctors learned to be saints of margin notes. The state's motive was not purely noble. Books burnish rule. A king who keeps a citadel of knowledge signals that his regime is sophisticated, generous, and permanent. Yet the scholars were no puppets. They argued, quarreled, and sometimes mocked court tastes, building an academic ethos that outlived patrons and palaces. Alexandria's everyday life made all this plausible. In the Rhakotis Quarter, fishermen hauled nets beside perfume makers. In a canopic way's shade, goldsmiths etched thin sheets for diadems while book dealers whispered that a newly collated Sappho had arrived. On race days, the stadium's roar proved that even philosophers need spectacle. The Pharos blinked. Grain convoys slid out like commas in the sentence of empire. And in lecture halls, students learned that to define a word well is to lay the first stone of a bridge. Critics later complained that collecting can become hoarding and that cataloging can replace understanding. Perhaps, but for a long, bright hour, the Ptolemies bet on mind as infrastructure, and Egypt, already a master of canals and calendars, added bibliography to its repertoire of eternal architectures. Religions survive by translation. The Ptolemies grasped that if Greeks were to feel at home and Egyptians were not to feel evicted, the gods must meet at the door and share bread. Serapis, born at Memphis in concept, Enthroned in Alexandria in marble, blended Osirian afterlife power and apisbal vigor with Zeus-like dignity. He looked Greek, bearded a modius grain measure, on his head signaling plenty. He behaved Egyptian, keeper of healing dreams, lord of fertility, patron of just order. His temple, the Serapeum, became a civic anchor where processions braided laments and laughter, philosophy, and petition. Alongside Serapis rose a queenly star, Isis, whose tender ferocity and mastery of magic made her the most portable of deities. Her cult, already ancient, now traveled confidently on Ptolemaic ships to Delos, Piraeus, Sicily, and later Rome, where sailors thanked her for fair winds, mothers for milk, and lovers for luck. This was not cynical marketing. It was statecraft that understood devotion. In Upper Egypt, the dynasty restored and expanded temples at Edfu, Horus, Dendera, Hathor, and Philae, Isis, inscribing walls with hieroglyphs so crisp they feel carved yesterday. These monuments broadcast a message to village priests and farmers. The king, whatever his language at dinner, feeds the gods and thereby feeds you. Priestly synods met and issued bilingual decrees in hieroglyphs, Demotic and Greek, that praised royal favors and adjusted ritual calendars, the famous pattern that would culminate later in the Rosetta Decree. In these texts, we see a political technology perfected. The crown writes itself in a temple time, and temples write themselves in a royal narrative, so that taxes feel like offerings and offerings like social insurance. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Greek festivals, Dionysia, athletic games, coexisted with Egyptian processions, teaching citizens to keep two calendars without tearing their souls. The weave was tight, but not seamless. Revolts in Upper Egypt flared when tax pressure bit or when local prophets stirred pride. Banditry nipped caravan ankles. Ethnic quarrels in Alexandria occasionally erupted, especially between Greek and Jewish communities whose neighborhoods overlapped in commerce and competed in status. The court replied with infrastructure and inclusion, roads, wells, priestly honors, and with spectacle, because parades and building dedications anesthetized discontent almost as well as fair laws do. In art, hybrid styles proliferated. Greek-style portrait heads with individual wrinkles sat atop Egyptian bodies locked into timeless pose. Mummies from the Fayum wore luminous and caustic portraits, faces looking straight at us across 2 millennia with unnerving presence, while their linen wrappings preserved the old promises to the Ka and Ba. The message, delivered in stone, paint, incense, and coin, was that a person could be both Alexandrian and Egyptian, both subject of a Greek king and child of Osiris, without paradox, so long as Mot held in deeds if not in grammar. By the time Ptolemy III and IV reigned, the formula was famous enough to be imitated badly and defended brilliantly. Success bred complacency in some rulers, excess in pageantry, and overconfidence in wars abroad. Yet the religious synthesis endured because it lived in kitchens and courtyards, not just in edicts. Housewives whispered Isis names over sick children. Dockworkers wore amulets stamped with Serapis Modius. Farmers at Dendera smiled when Hathor's sistrum rattled through town. The dynastic gamble. Bind city to countryside with gods who can speak both dialects of the heart. Paid off for generations. Still, strains were building. Fiscal pressure, foreign wars, and the growing gravitational pull of Rome. In the next act, we will watch how an economy of wonders can harden into a burden, how priests can become creditors, and how a brilliant hybrid kingdom negotiates the slow tightening of a Mediterranean noose. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became a workshop for abundance engineered at imperial scale. The Nile had always been a predictable partner, Now the crown treated it as an investment portfolio. Irrigation was tuned and expanded. Basins regraded, canals cleared, embankments shored. In the Fayum, a bold reclamation program turned marsh into chessboard fields, creating new villages where Greek veterans planted vines beside Egyptian neighbors sowing barley. Land tenure diversified into a mosaic: royal domain, temple estates, private plots, and clerical allotments for soldiers who paid rent in loyalty and wheat. Surveyors with cords and rods redrew cadasters after every flood. Scribes annotated margins like accountants who loved mud. The result was throughput: more arable, more reliable, more taxable, grain that could feed Alexandria's swelling appetite and still sail as export to Cyprus, Rhodes, and, eventually, Rome's hungry markets. Money joined mud as the second element of prosperity. The Ptolemies minted silver coinage that standardized payments and lubricated trade from the Delta to the Aegean. Villagers still measured wages in bread and beer, but rents, customs, and army pay increasingly counted in drachmas. Granaries doubled as banks. Receipts on papyrus became negotiable promises. A farmer might borrow against next season's yield, staking not only field but access to water gates. The state ran monopolies on high-value goods: oil from imported olives, papyrus sheets, salt, sometimes beer, turning supply chains into revenue rivers that flowed through royal treasuries before trickling back into payrolls and patronage. Temples remained economic engines too, with estates, workshops, and festivals that redirected wealth into local circuits. Donations purchased favor from gods and jobs for mortals. Alexandria functioned as the condenser where all this vapor turned to rain. Its harbors inhaled amphorae of wine and exhaled sacks of wheat. Its warehouses stacked sesame oil next to papyrus bales. Its customs houses stamped seals that guaranteed weights and hopes. The pharos blinked like a metronome for convoys, and the Mouse-Ion translated curiosity into practical math. Better maps for pilots, better calendars for shippers. Meanwhile, inland market towns synchronized to that pulse. Donkey caravans queued at toll posts where officials checked measures with cubit sticks and poured a little oil on his scales to prove they played fair. The economy's genius wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. It was management. Matching canal openings to sowing dates, coin flows to tax deadlines, and festival calendars to retail cycles, so that when a god's bark processed, stalls were thick with figs, and the scent of fried fish sold more prayers than priests did. In this choreography, Egypt under the Lagids perfected a truth older than the pyramids. Abundance is a discipline before it is a gift. If stone carried eternity, papyrus carried the day. Under the Ptolemies, the written word multiplied into a dense undergrowth of contracts, petitions, receipts, leases, licenses, and audits that made the kingdom legible to itself. Picture a village office at midday. A clerk with ink-stained fingers weighs a copper coin, checks a measure of sesame, and then drafts a lease for a parcel by the East Canal. A woman arrives with a petition. Her neighbor moved a boundary stone the width of 2 palms, and the scribe records the grievance for the top arch. A soldier renews his oil license, since pressing and retail fall under crown monopoly. A brewer pays the beer tax and receives a sealed tag to tie around a neck of amphora. Stamps thud, seals bite clay. Names unroll in Greek and Demotic like twin vines, ensuring both court and countryside can read. The tax system was elaborate but not mindless. There were land taxes calibrated to soil and water access, poll taxes scaled by status and profession, customs at canal gates, monopoly rents for oil, papyrus, and salt, and liturgies, public service obligations that might assign a citizen to maintain a road segment or fund a patrol. Collection mixed salaried officials with tax farmers who bid for rights to gather certain revenues. An efficient but risky mechanism that tempted overreach. The safety valve was paperwork. Subjects could appeal through tiers of authority, first to local magistrates, then to strategoi, and sometimes to the king himself. Petitions survived that read like plays. Plaintiff, defendant, witnesses, verdict, where the language of Mott learns to speak in Greek legal formulas. Even when injustice won, the existence of the channel moderated rage. Knowing one can write is part of how one keeps from writing. Monopolies drew resentment, yet they also performed logistics the private sector couldn't at that scale. Oil illustrates the balance. The crown imported olives or contracted estates to grow them, ran presses, set qualities and prices, and distributed via licensed dealers so lamps, kitchens, and temples stayed supplied. In return, citizens complied, sometimes grudgingly, because the lamps stayed lit. The state's appetite for data was relentless. Censuses counted people, livestock, and trees. Metrological boards checked weights. Auditors surprised warehouses. Inspectors popped ribs and asked for hidden jars. But this surveillance carried an upside: predictability. A baker knew the flour allotment would arrive on schedule. A temple steward could plan feasts. A farmer could plant wheat instead of barley if the canal manager promised a longer watering. In the margins of contracts, we glimpsed the social economy that made all this tolerable. Gifts to clerks for speed, festival remissions for loyalty, and occasional amnesties that reset arrears like a cool breeze over hot ledgers. The real marvel is cultural. A civilization once famed for chiseling prayers in a limestone learned to trust loose-leaf order. A world where a woman's marriage contract protects her dowry. A loan deed lists the collateral by row and furrow, and a birth register assigns a child to tax class and temple calendar at once. The Ptolemaic state did not merely rule Egypt. It taught it to right itself daily, and in doing so extended the old religion of balance into the secular miracle of receipts that add up. Life under the Lagids felt different depending on which street, or canal, you walked. In Alexandria, boulevards thrummed with accents. Macedonian officers in white cloaks, Jewish scholars parsing scripture into Greek, Egyptian sailors bargaining for lamp wicks, Syrian spice sellers hawking cinnamon to perfume makers decanting dreams into alabaster flasks. Gymnasia trained bodies and loyalties. Festivals spilled wine and slogans. Synagogues, temples, and the Serapeum shared sky and sometimes suspicion. Ethnic frictions flared, especially between Greek and Jewish communities, requiring royal arbitration and occasional force. Yet cosmopolitan habits often won the day. Mixed business partnerships, bilingual contracts, and neighborhoods where a child might swear by Serapis in the market and hear an Isis him at his aunt's door by dusk. Phaeum towns displayed another weave. Greek veterans managing presses beside Egyptian farmers whose crocodile god shrines collected votive hatchlings. Workshops crafting encaustic portraits for mummies, faces painted with molten wax and pigment, while embalmers wrapped bodies in old promises about the Ka and Ba, class cut deeper than ethnicity. At the top stood royal kin and grandees with estates, monopolies, and court access. Below them, a swath of officials, merchants, scribes, and contractors who made the engine hum. Then village cultivators, craftsmen, boatmen, and soldiers whose calendars mixed rent days with feast days. Slavery existed, household, workshop, quarry, but Egypt's old habit of manumission and integration kept the social skin from splitting. Freed people slid into neighborhood webs where reliability mattered more than origin. Women held notable legal agency. They owned property, initiated suits, negotiated dowries, and sometimes ran businesses. Papyri show wives lending to husbands, widows managing orchards, and priestesses petitioning governors with the calm of people accustomed to being heard. Such rites were not utopian, but they were real enough to make contracts a form of armor women wore in a world of tall men. Stress tested the system. Banditry nipped canal roads when pay fell behind. Strikes, echoes from Deir, el-Medina's past, reappeared among specialized workers when rations or coin delayed. Rural revolts sometimes rose in Upper Egypt, sermons of grievance preached with spears. The crown alternated carrots and sticks, amnesties, targeted tax relief, and public works in good years, garrisons and confiscations in bad. Temples acted as social banks, redistributing offerings and hosting festivals that stitched mood to music. On market days, the smell of fried mullet, warm sesame cakes, and river lotus simmered politics in a tolerance long enough for neighbors to exchange jokes and grain. Belonging was not a passport. It was a routine. Greeting the canal keeper by name, keeping the shrine lamp supplied, signing your rent receipt with a practiced hand, teaching your child both alphabets because the world asked for both. In that routine, Egypt under the Ptolemies turned hybridity into habit. People learned to navigate double calendars, Greek civic, Egyptian sacred, double courts, polis and native, and double tongues, Greek and Demotic, without losing the thread of themselves. The countryside kept Mott by keeping dike straight. The city kept it by keeping schedules and spectacles. When Rome's gravity later tugged the kingdom into its orbit, it would find not a brittle glass house, but a resilient organism, one that had already mastered the art of being many things at once while staying in the marrow Egyptian. That is why the next act, Cleopatra VII, Caesar and Antony, and the end of pharaohs, unfolds not as a simple fall, but as the last, dazzling negotiation between a brilliant local order and the largest empire the Mediterranean had yet imagined. When Cleopatra VII ascended the throne in 51 BCE, she was not the sultry myth posterity prefers, but a tough-minded polyglot in a house of knives. The Ptolemaic court had long practiced sibling co-rule as a way to keep power inside the family. In practice, it bred civil wars without leaving the palace. Cleopatra initially shared the crown with her younger brother husband Ptolemy XIII, while the economy strained under drought years and unpaid soldiers blinked at the palace with hungry eyes. The queen, educated in Alexandria's broad curriculum, spoke Egyptian, rare among her Greek-speaking dynasty. Along with Greek and other tongues, she could charm priests at Dendera in hieroglyphic idiom and parry with philosophers in the library shadow. Her early moves show administrative nerve. She purged some courtiers, courted temple elites, and tried to stabilize coinage and grain flows so bakeries would not become riot schools. But a teenage prince backed by powerful guardians and a capital wired for intrigue made stability as fragile as a papyrus boat in harbor swells. Into this churning delta sailed Julius Caesar, fresh from defeating Pompey's forces in the Roman Civil War, carrying the weight of a ruthless republic retooling itself into empire. Pompey, seeking refuge, had been murdered by Ptolemy's ministers in a tone-deaf bid to impress Caesar. The Roman arrived disgusted and unplacated. Cleopatra seized the hinge of history with audacity that later poets dressed in velvet. She smuggled herself past hostile guards. Legend has her rolled in a carpet. Practical minds suggest a linen sack, and presented her case directly in Caesar's quarters. The scene has been staged as seduction ever since. It was also politics of the highest order. She argued that Egypt needed one competent monarch allied to Rome, not two bickering minors bleeding the granaries dry. Caesar, who admired boldness and understood grain arithmetic, sided with her. Fighting erupted in Alexandria's streets and harbor, Roman cohorts against palace factions. while Caesar tried to keep supply lines open and fires, literal and political, contained. In this crucible, Cleopatra proved not only persuasive but resilient, navigating barricades of rumor and logistics. The war's smoke later drifted into legend. Talk of scrolls lost from the library in the melee. Stories of palaces turned into fortresses. When victory settled, Cleopatra reigned with a younger brother as ceremonial co-king, but the real hinge was her partnership with Caesar. She traveled with him on the Nile in a stately progress that doubled as audit and theater. Towns pledged, priests sang, and the river, Egypt's sternest voter, seemed to approve as granaries refilled. In Rome, she bore a son, Ptolemy XV Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion. Debates about paternity filled gossip alleys and senatorial corridors alike, but Cleopatra measured success by leverage more than laurel. Egypt remained sovereign, her throne braced by the most dangerous man in the Mediterranean and by a reputation for royal charisma that made even jaded Romans squint into the sun. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Roman world fractured along new fault lines. In the east, Mark Antony, soldier, showman, and shrewd judge of morale, commanded legions and hearts with equal ease. His and Cleopatra's meeting at Tarsus has been lacquered by romance, but beneath the perfume lay policy. Antony needed money and grain for campaigns against Parthia. Cleopatra wanted secure borders, debt relief, and room to breathe without a Roman administrator sitting at her elbow. She sailed upriver by sea in a floating pageant, golden prow, purple sails, musicians, and scented air, less as flirtation than as contract. Egypt can bankroll ambition, treat her as a client queen, and she will behave like a patron state. Antony, who appreciated theater that ends in logistics, accepted. Their partnership, intimate, political, and increasingly public, reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean's rumor economy. Cleopatra's court synchronized the alliance with ritual. At Alexandria, she staged the donations, grand ceremonies in which Antony, seated like a Dionysus reborn and Cleopatra as Isis triumphant, assigned territories to Cleopatra and her children. Cyprus, Phoenicia, parts of Syria and Cilicia, and lands in Armenia recently rested in campaigns. Whether these grants were de jure or aspirational mattered less than the message. A Hellenistic East restored under an Egyptian-centered household, with Caesarion proclaimed King of Kings, a title that rattled Rome like a drum in a Senate chamber. Coinage, iconography, and proclamations fused Greek, Egyptian, and royal theatrics into a claim that seemed both nostalgic, echoing Alexander's world, and dangerously new, a non-Roman settlement of Roman I territories. Cleopatra was not a monarch clinging to an old Nile. She was architecting a post-Caesar order where Alexandria, not Rome, cast the starring light. Opposite them stood Octavian, the future Augustus, Caesar's adopted son and master of cold patience. He understood the empire's newest weapon system, propaganda. In Italy, he cultivated an image of Roman modesty and law, running a smear campaign that painted Antony as emasculated by an Oriental queen and Cleopatra as a sorceress who bewitched a once virtuous general. The donations became proof of treason, Caesarian's titles, an insult to Caesar's will. Octavian fed fear. What if Rome's grain is hostage to Alexandria's will? What if a queen dictates from the Serapeum? The Senate, tired of civil war, but susceptible to panic properly staged, listened. As lines tightened, navies mattered. Cleopatra and Antony assembled fleets. Egyptian grain bought wood and oarsmen. Alexandrian engineers new harbors. Phoenician allies lent hulls. But logistics are not glamour. Crews drill, Pelags win sulk. By the time both sides edged toward Actium on Greece's western coast in 31 BCE, the war had morphed from lovers' melodrama into a brutally modern equation of tonnage, morale, supply, and narrative. Actium was not a duel, but a siege by sea, a long strangulation of Antony. Cleopatra forces bottled in the Ambracian Gulf, while Agrippa, Octavian's brilliant admiral, cut their supply islands and harassed their routes. On the decisive day, winds and nerves aligned for Octavian. Antony's heavier. Towered ships could batter in close quarters, but Agrippa controlled maneuver and morale. Disease gnawed, desertions nibbled. Cleopatra's royal squadron, loaded with treasure and the hope of strategic withdrawal, pierced the battle line and sprinted for open water, a move planned as contingency but read by Antony's captains as chaos. He followed with a core group, intending to fight another day from Egypt's safer coasts. The rest unraveled under pressure. Propaganda would later recast the breakout as cowardice. Strategically, it was a failed reset in a game Octavian had already won by logistics and messaging. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra turned the city into a citadel and a stage. She fortified approaches, replenished arsenals, and performed rituals of sovereignty with a defiant precision that said, Egypt is not a province yet. She explored escape hatches, negotiations, separate peace, a plan to send Caesarion east with trusted tutors and the treasury's portable core. Octavian advanced with patient, pitiless method. He seized the grain lifeline, penned a fleet, and courted defections with promises forged in Roman iron. Antony, harried by collapses of loyalty and the physics of depleted pay chests, fought fiercely in last engagements, then lost hope as Octavian marched within sight of the palace gardens. In the final act, Cleopatra retreated to a mausoleum she had prepared for her own eternity. Gold, garments, a curated future, turning architecture into strategy, a fortress of death that could deny Octavian his living trophy. Their suicides became lore. Antony told, falsely, perhaps deliberately, that Cleopatra had died, fell on his sword, carried bleeding to her presence. He reportedly breathed his last elevated to her balcony, a grisly pieta of a civil war that stretched too long. Cleopatra met Octavian, negotiated for her children, and measured the man who would rule the world. She understood he wanted her alive for a Roman triumph. Chained behind his chariot, displayed to a city that had been taught to fear her. The last pharaoh refused that script. Ancient sources speak of an ASP, the cobra of Wadjet, smuggled in figs, Egyptian icon fitting queenly defiance. Others suggest fast-acting poison prepared by court scientists. However done, her death was a ritual of control, choosing the manner of departure when the matter of the world had slipped away. Octavian spared her image no mercy in narrative, but spared her city some. Alexandria was neither sacked to the ground nor stripped of its sacred bones. He took the treasury, secured the fleet, executed Caesarion, too many Caesars. He quipped, cold as marble, and folded Egypt into Rome as his personal domain, a crown estate that fed legions and bribed senators by reliable schedules. Thus ended more than a dynasty. With Cleopatra's passing in 30 BCE, 3 millennia of pharaonic rule gave way to a different grammar of empire. Temples continued. Philae would ring with Isis hymns for centuries. Priests tended cult and clocks, and scribes wrote Demotic and Greek side by side as late as anyone cared to keep both inks wet. Hieroglyphs still marched across stone, though the last dated example would eventually fall silent in late antiquity. Egypt did not vanish, it translated. Grain convoys now sailed under Roman eagles. The prefect at Alexandria answered to the princeps. Tax receipts bore new titles. Soldiers in garrisons swore by Jupiter alongside Ammonius and Serapis. In workshops, mummy portraits looked out with Roman realism strapped to Egyptian promises. In villages, women bartered sesame cakes and lined their eyes with coal at dawn as they had when Khufu's casing stones still flashed. The end of the pharaohs was a hinge, not an abyss. A queen who fused languages and calendars met a man who fused republic and monarchy. Their collision snapped an age and soldered another. And the Nile, indifferent and intimate, kept time, flood sow, harvest, teaching every new ruler the same old lesson. Greatness here is maintenance first, spectacle second, and memory always. When Octavian refitted himself as Augustus, Egypt became the keystone of an empire's food supply and a laboratory for imperial habit. A Roman prefect governed from Alexandria, answering directly to the princeps. Senators were barred from entering without permission, a legal fence that protected the emperor's private grain patch. Bureaucracy remained dense. Greek stayed the language of administration. Demotic kept contracts humming in the countryside, and temple scribes continued to count cattle and dates with a precision that would have pleased any vizier. Egypt's gods did not collapse under Latin, they migrated. The cult of Isis exploded around the Mediterranean. Temples sprouted in Pompeii, Piraeus, Marseille, even Londinium. Sailors dedicated altars after surviving storms, and women sought the goddesses' help in childbirth and grief. In Rome, Serapis and Anubis walked in festivals beside Jupiter and Venus. Their processions a choreography of incense that made the Tiber smell faintly of the Nile. Alexandria remained a brain, but now one plugged into Roman circuits. Philosophers argued under colonnades. Mathematicians copied and critiqued. Heron tinkered with pneumatics. Ptolemy of Alexandria charted stars and codified geocentric models that Europe would debate for 15 centuries. Libraries waxed and waned. Fires and politics nibbled at collections. Yet the practice of scholarship survived. The habit of cataloging, collating, and disputing texts like citizens of a republic of the mind. In the churning 4th century, as Christianity surged from persecuted sect to imperial faith, Egypt became both cradle and crucible. Monasticism germinated in its deserts. Anthony withdrew to fight inward pharaohs of pride and fear. Pachomius organized communities with rules that sounded like polite armies. Coptic hymns braided village melody with theology. Bishops clashed. Athanasius' stubborn defense of orthodoxy turned councils into war zones of syllables. Pilgrims came to kiss relics. New saints replaced old gods along processional routes that felt ancient even when the names had changed. Temples did not vanish overnight. They faded. Imperial edicts in the late 4th and early 5th centuries restricted sacrifices and temple incomes. Some shrines converted to churches. Others became quarries of ready-cut stone, and a few hung on at the edges of empire like patient stars. Philae, island home of Isis near the Nubian frontier, persisted astonishingly late, its priests conducting rites into the 6th century, bargaining with Byzantine officials and Nubian neighbors. There, on August 24th, 394 CE, a priest carved what we recognize as the last known dated hieroglyphic inscription, a small scratch of eternity closing a 3,000-year sentence. The script did not die, so much as fall out of conversation. Coptic, written with Greek letters plus Demotic signs, carried the Egyptian language forward in homilies, amulets, and lullabies. The old gods found afterlives in talismans and folkways. The old calendar left fingerprints on feast days and planting lore. Under Arab rule after 641, the Nile's arithmetic, tax, canal, harvest remained the state's heartbeat. Arabic became the public language. Scholars like Ibn Washia later peered curiously at mysterious signs on stones. Egypt's identity layered rather than replaced, a palimpsest where Osiris, Christ, and Quranic verses could share a shoreline in the same afternoon light. For medieval pilgrims and merchants, Egypt was a rumor theater. Pyramids as Joseph's granaries, sphinxes as jinn turned to stone, obelisks as frozen spears of sorcerers. The Ottoman centuries kept rhythms steady. Taxes, caravans, and a cosmopolitan Cairo, but European imaginations sharpened again in the early modern age. In 1798, Napoleon marched in with soldiers and savants. His campaign faltered militarily, but intellectually it detonated. The monumental description, the El-Egypti, volumes of engravings and essays, turned the West's curiosity into an album of measurements and sketches. Temples at Dendera and Edfu etched plate by plate. Flora and fauna counted, as if the Nile were a cabinet of wonders. Most catalytic was a broken slab, the Rosetta Stone, inscribed in hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Greek. Scholars sniffed the key. The race began. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion shouted, "Je tiens l'affaire." I've got it, and cracked the hieroglyphic code by seeing phonetics where Europe had seen only pictures. His method married patience to audacity. Cartouches of foreign royal names provided footholds. Coptic supplied living echoes of ancient words. Comparisons with Demotic and Greek built bridges. The silent choir on temple walls sang again. Over the 19th century, excavation shifted from treasure hunt to discipline under figures like Mariette, Petrie, and Reisner, who refined stratigraphy, cataloging, and typology. Photography froze trenches in silver salts. Museums in Cairo, London, Paris, Berlin, and Turin filled with statues, coffins, and papyri. Meanwhile, Egyptian scholars and workers, often unnamed in early reports, kept sites alive with skill passed hand to hand, a continuity of craft stretching back to Deir el-Medina's chisels and ledgers. But rediscovery braided brilliance with wounds. The 19th and early 20th century appetite for antiquities fueled looting, divided finds under colonial rules, and scattered heritage into vitrines far from the desert wind that birthed it. Narratives often sidelined Egyptians as laborers at their own past's doorstep. In the later 20th century, conscience caught up. The rescue of Abu Simbel during the Aswan High Dam project. Temples sawed, numbered, and reassembled above the new lake became a global act of cultural engineering and cooperation led by UNESCO. Egyptian archaeologists such as Zaki Hawass, Salima Ikram, Naguib Kanawati, and many others pushed research, conservation, and public storytelling from Cairo outward, while university missions worldwide increasingly partnered with local teams, trained conservators, and kept artifacts in situ. Today, 3D scanning, ground-penetrating radar, and micro-CT of mummies let us study without stripping. Stable isotope analysis tastes ancient water in tooth enamel. DNA, handled with caution and humility, asks how families and populations moved. Museums revisit provenance. Communities near sites gain more voice. Tourism balances access with preservation. Egyptology is learning that to love a past responsibly is to share power in the present. Credit local expertise. Respect tombs as human stories, not prop rooms, and treat every shirt as a word in a book that belongs to many readers. All the while, the spell of ancient Egypt kept charming. Howard Carter's 1922 opening of Tutankhamun's tomb dazzled a world recovering from war. Art Deco borrowed lotus and zigzags. Filmmakers turned mummies into metaphors. Classrooms pinned maps of Giza like badges. Yet the truest thrill wasn't gold. It was grammar, the sudden ability to hear individual voices, a workman's complaint on an ostrakon, a widow's contract, a hymn to the rising sun that sounds like a morning in any century. Rediscovery, at its best, replaced fantasy with intimacy. Ancient Egypt's endurance in the modern imagination is a double-edged gift. Its monuments tempt easy myths. Aliens with laser levels, lost Atlanteans with secret batteries, stories that replace human genius with spectacle. But the limestone says otherwise. What raised pyramids and wrote hymns was not sorcery. It was organization, diet turned into labor through bread and beer, geometry grid-snapped against sunrise, and an ethic named Mot that trained people to see fairness as a form of engineering. The real wonder is that a civilization so old left us so much paperwork, receipts and school exercises, wills and lullabies, jokes and repairs. When we honor that ordinariness, the extraordinary grows brighter. Khufu becomes not a mythic tyrant, but a node in a machine of surveyors and bakers. Hatshepsut not a curiosity, but a stateswoman who translated prosperity into stone. Deir el-Medina not a workers' camp, but a literate neighborhood with strikes, gossip, and prayers. Modern creators remix Egypt in many keys. Afrofuturist artists and writers fold pyramids into starships, recentering Africa as a source of futures rather than a background for others' pasts. Fashion houses stitch pleats like Nile ripples. Game designers turn the Book of the Dead into level design. Poets borrow the feather of Mot to weigh our digital hearts. These appropriations can honor or flatten. The difference lies in listening. Do we treat Egypt as a spice rack for exotic effect, or as a chorus of specific people whose names can still be read? Sinew, Amo son of Abana, Merit-Ka, Nefertari, each with a measurable life? Museums and filmmakers now grapple with representation. Resist whitening antiquity. Avoid caricature. Show Nubia not as a footnote, but as a partner and, at times, Egypt's savior and teacher. The 25th dynasty's granite calm deserves equal screen time to Ramesses' boast. The Coptic language deserves to be heard as a living bridge, not a dusty footnote. The future of Egypt's past will be written in climate and care. Rising groundwater saltstone, heat stresses pigments, human traffic erodes, modern dams redraw silt and flood rhythms. Urban sprawl nibbles at necropolises. Tourism revenues swing with politics and pandemics. Solutions look Egyptian in spirit. Maintenance first. Drainage projects under temples are as important as new discoveries. Site guardians need stable pay and training. Local schools should own the narrative so children grow up as stakeholders, not bystanders. Technology helps. 3D models that let scholars walk closed tombs. Machine learning to stitch fragments. Sensors to warn of microclimate shifts. But technology without community is just a shiny shabdi. Pretty, obedient, and useless when the fieldwork starts. Ethical debates continue. How to study mummies respectfully. When to display. When to cloak. How to return looted pieces without freezing research. How to ensure that excavation seasons benefit villages with clinics, water, and jobs. Every answer worth trusting echoes the old contract between living and dead, reciprocity. And what do we carry away when the credits roll and the sun sets behind a ridge of broken pylons? Perhaps a discipline of awe. Egypt teaches that immortality is less a metaphysical accident than a social practice. Write names clearly, build well, pay workers on time, weigh the heart against a feather before judging neighbors. Remember your debt aloud. It teaches that beauty can be useful, that proportion calms the city as much as it pleases the eye, and that the most heroic act is sometimes the most boring. Fixing the canal again before flood season. In a loud century, Egypt whispers, be continuous. Align your house to the sunrise of your values. Practice rituals that make good habits easier than bad ones. Keep a ledger of kindness. If you do, then 3,000 years from now, if anyone reads our walls, the lines might still hold. Not because we were gods, but because we planned like gardeners, loved like scribes copying a perfect line, and kept not as a slogan, but as the way we laid each brick of our ordinary, miraculous days. You just crossed 3,000 years in 2 hours. Well done. We watched the Nile turn mud into surplus into temples, and temples into a calendar that kept people honest. We learned how pyramids were built not by mystery forces, but by organized labor, precise measurement, and bread and beer logistics. We saw that mummification was chemistry in the service of memory, and hieroglyphs were not pictures, but a living script that let Egypt speak about taxes, love, law, and hope. We saw rise and reset, old kingdom grandeur, middle kingdom good governance, new kingdom empire, the shock of Amarna and the calm of restoration. We watched Ramesses II turn a draw into a story and a story into policy. Temples act as banks of grain and meaning. Artisans strike for back pay, and ordinary families hold civilization together with chores, contracts, prayers, and jokes. We followed Egypt out onto wider seas, treaties, trade routes, migrating gods, and into new hands. Kushite renewals, Sate classicism, Persian audit, Greek translation, and a city called Alexandria that made curiosity state policy. Cleopatra's end wasn't just tragedy. It was a hinge. Egypt didn't vanish. It learned to speak Roman and, later, Coptic and Arabic, while the Nile kept time. Moral of the story? Greatness is maintenance before spectacle. Ma'at, truth, balance, proportion isn't an idea, it's a habit. Measure fairly, pay on time, repair the canal, remember the names of the living and the dead. When a culture does that, its art becomes a promise and its ruins keep talking. Egypt reminds us that the most eternal things are built one careful, ordinary day at a time. If this journey lit a spark, subscribe to History Teller YT, tap the bell, and tell me in the comments which chapter surprised you most. Was it Hatshepsut's Pun expedition, the workers' strike at Deir el-Medina, or the way the library weaponized footnotes? Next up, we're diving into another world that lasted against the odds. So bring your curiosity back here. Until then, keep your heart light, your lines straight, and your calendar honest. See you soon on History Teller YT.